Afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's with enormous pleasure, and after this morning's absolutely splendid session, with great anticipation, that I open the afternoon session, which is the main course of this wonderful, unique feast of not only congratulating Professor Lorraine Dustin, Professor Evelyn Fox-Keller, and Professor Simon Schaffer on winning this fabulous award, but of hosting them here together and enabling us in this session to discuss their work after using the morning session to ask them to muse about where we're at in the discipline of the history of science, where we might be going, where we should be going, what are the great challenges of the day. And as I remarked in the morning discussion, for those of you who weren't there, this is more, much more than a celebration of the enormous once-in-a-lifetime, richly deserved personal honor awarded to Evelyn and Rainey and Simon, the laureates of the 2018 Dan David Prize, which was awarded this year for the first time in the history of science. Is the microphone okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Now, due to the nature of the Dan David Prize, which does not rotate its disciplines, it is therefore also a once-in-a-lifetime celebration of the very field of history of science, and in view of the large and vibrant Israeli HPS community, and now I realize that Hall 144 was not a gamble. It was really the only option in the building that could actually contain you. So due to this large and vibrant Israeli HPS community, it is at the very same time a once-in-a-lifetime intimate rejoicing in the achievements of the three of the field's not only most prominent leaders, in the achievements of three close and dear colleagues and friends, a rare and moving event by any count. So congratulations once again to you, dear Evelyn, dear Rainey, and dear Simon, for the just and fabulous recognition you have received for your lifelong formative contributions to our field. The session is dedicated to a celebration of your work. Now, we could have done it by having you three sit through a parade of presentations by colleagues and students discussing your work. But we preferred to take advantage, to do it differently, and to take advantage of this wonderful, unique opportunity of having you here together and to ask you to prepare, and I know it's rather impolite to burden a prize laureates with requests for lectures, but to ask you to prepare a brief presentation on some major aspect, not to muse about the discipline, but some major aspect of your recent or current work for us to discuss. And one reason for doing it this way, despite the burden it puts on you, is that by allowing you to present your own work rather than have others discuss it, will enable us to better appreciate how differently you approach the field and how your singular voices and contributions over the years have differently informed it and differently shifted its frontiers over at least the last almost 4 decades. So before turning you over to the chairs of each session, as you've seen the program, we'll have a full hour devoted to each one of the laureates, beginning with a brief introduction by the assigned chair of that session, and then a 25-minute or so lecture by Rainey, then Evelyn, then Simon, after which we'll have the rest of the hour for the discussion of the paper rather than a panel discussion at the end. So before turning you over to your chairs, let me just say a brief word about the way your very different approaches have carved up and transformed the field over the years. Now, in sharp contrast to the way the scientific advisors to the prize displayed their rather positivistic, rather Whiggish vision of the history of science in the lively cinematic depiction of the triumphant march of the natural sciences that was screened at the award ceremony before your prizes were awarded to you. Before calling you up, your work combines, and it's very interesting to say something about this against that backdrop. Your work combines radically to subvert that picture, not by denying any one detail of it, except where it was perhaps mistaken, but by historicizing every aspect of it. It is as if the three of you had conspired, as I said before, to divide the territory three ways, with Rainey Dustin taking responsibility for what we might call science's second-order normative vocabulary, Evelyn Fox Keller for science's first-order conceptual vocabulary, and Simon for science practical, set of practices, theoretical, mathematical, and material. With a view to historicizing them as thoroughly as the film supposedly introducing your work at the ceremony was positivistic. Now, the beauty of your work is that, unlike stodgy philosophers like myself, yours was not and is not a theoretical in-principle argument for the essential context dependency of every aspect of science and talking about science you've chosen to study, but is wisely and painstakingly detailed historical analysis. Okay? In Rainey's case, and I mean, one way of putting it philosophically is by using Bernard Williams's and Michael Waltz's and others' distinction between thick and thin concepts. Okay, every culture has the concept of good, of bad, of appropriate, of inappropriate, of revolting. But each and every culture lends meaning to those thin concepts, which are shared by very, very different thick concepts, which give, meaning and significance to the good of each different community. Now, what Rainey's work shows in talking about science, in what Evelyn's work shows talking about the vocabulary of science, and what Simon's work shows talking about practices, is that every single term they touch, rationality, objectivity, this morning knowledge itself, in Rainey's work, the scientific vocabulary, we heard something about gene and genome this morning from Evelyn, and the practices that Simon has worked on, the experimental practices, the mathematical practices, are only seemingly fixed during history. They operate as thin concepts which, according to their time and place, acquire a thickness which is local and contextual and dynamic and changing. And therefore, it is, as it was discussed this morning, it's crucially important for history of science to be in touch with latter-day science, with current science, but not in order to not in order to confirm the correctness or the rightness, but to get a sense of the way those thin concepts now acquire this thick, this thick meaning. I was trying to think of a term that does this with practices as well. If you can talk about a thin and a thick practice, I don't know. It works with concept. So each one of the 3 sessions will be chaired by someone well acquainted with the work of the laureates celebrated. Rivka Feldchai, whom I'll call up in a second, will chair Rainey's first session. Snait Gissis will chair Evelyn's, and then I will, with great pleasure, chair Simon's at the end. So congratulations once again, and let's get to work. Rivka, Rainey, the platform is yours. Thank you very much.
Professor Lorraine Dustin, and was extremely enthusiastic about this role. And you know I'm a good pupil, so I will immediately start to say what I have to say. So, brilliant, enormously productive, and effective in promoting an innovative research program, Lorraine Dustin has carried with her an emblematic image of a scholar, a humanist, and a friend to us here in Israel, as well as to many other centers of learning in the world. Deep insights combined with a broad historical picture and crystal clear formulations are among the outstanding qualities that characterize her work. I wish, in fact, I had the rhetorical gift necessary to give her a real laudatio, as she deserves, but I shall certainly try. From the beginning of her career in the 1980s, Rainey, if I may, has been relentlessly committed to the core epistemological and moral values of the European Enlightenment. However, unlike many of her generation who tended to view the Enlightenment as a fixed and determined set of ideas, Rainey preferred to treat it as an open-ended project in need of critique, development, and ever-broadening application. Thus, she embarked upon a research program which set itself the goal of historicizing and contextualizing ideas and practices of rationality, seen as the heart of the Enlightenment, not in the abstract, but as rooted in material reality and concrete life world. From a very first book on probability through the thick volume on wonders and the order of nature that sums up attitudes to nature between the 12th and 18th century, and up to the volume on objectivity, Rainey has succeeded in constructing a breathtaking argument cum narrative, which show that whereas the end results of scientific theories and practices may be called universal, they always emerge in local contexts. Thus, they require painstaking historical analysis of the material practices and cultural values in which they are embedded. These books have become models to the new generation of historians of science, not only due to the depth of the research and scholarship they exhibit, but also because of their sharp, lucid, attractive, and inspiring style of writing and presentation. They have been translated to many languages, have reached wide audiences, and accumulated many prizes. They also gained the author membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Berlin Brandenburgische Akademie, der Wissenschaftler, and the permanent fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and not last and not least, an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University, and many other honors, prizes, and awards, which I shall not repeat here. Much more important, through her major historical philosophical works, Lorraine Dustin has succeeded to reshape the field of history and philosophy of science, transforming it into a great intellectual challenge and a potential focus of relevant moral and political message. As one of the leaders of the Max Planck Institute for History of Science in Berlin, Lorraine initiated a series of international and multicultural research groups who collaborated in exploring the historical nature of our categories of thinking about science, about the humanities, and about the relationships between them. In the framework of such collective endeavors, the role of experience, of demonstration, of proof throughout the centuries has been explored in a great variety of cultures. No less astonishing was the questioning of accepted dichotomies between ethics and science, art and science, or science and religion, in a series of volumes dealing with the moral authority of nature, the common language of art and science, knowledge and belief, and so on. A new light on the relationship between natural sciences and the humanities has been thrown through analysis of techniques of description and narration in medicine and natural history in the 15th century, in a project on Historia, explorations in the history of early modern empiricism. The meaning of empiricism has been further developed in a project on the history of scientific observation. Here, the cognitive and conscious theorization of observation has been concretely related to training the senses with or without instruments, presenting scientific results through description, map, graph, and table, and designing spaces for scientific inquiry. All these projects that culminated in recent years in a project on the sciences of the archive, those domains of research that require a long durée of observation and study of a phenomena like geology, astronomy, demography, we have been really lucky enough here to hear some of the results of this project 2 years ago when Rainey gave a lecture at the Israeli Academy of Science and the Art. The desire of knowledge, though, has been reflected not only in the themes of research, but also in the practice of exhibition, like the acrobats or the cut and paste, that have accompanied the different research themes along the years. This practice has greatly enhanced the investigation of the function of pictures and images in relation to text. Furthermore, it is also a practice that has reached out to the larger communities of citizens, thus reviving and maintaining the tradition of the humanities as both relevant and Wissenschaft. So there's still a lot to tell about the work of Lorraine Dustin, and I could go on and on with it. But this is not feasible. So I shall conclude by saying that anything written by Rainey is interesting, intriguing, stretching the imagination. And whether it concerns an epistemological problem, a survey of the main trends in science studies today, or proposals from new trends in critical inquiry. So congratulations again to Rainey, to Evelyn, to Simon, and being the laureate of this David Prize, which is a small correction to the lack of a Nobel Prize in history. Thanks very much.
Rivka, thank you for that graciously hyperbolic introduction. And thank you also for mentioning something which is the most important part, which is my best work has been done in company. My best work has been done with Katie Park on the book on wonders, with Peter Gallison on the book on objectivity, and all those research groups. I think of Things as Talk, of which Simon was part of. So this is recognition for all of my colleagues who have worked with me. I'm going to present something which unfortunately is characteristic of me. This is a splinter of a Graveyard of Scholars project. This is what I hope will be the penultimate chapter of a history of rules, all of them, everywhere, always, and it's due at the end of this year. It all began simply enough. A few years ago, in 2014, I published a book. It's one of these collective projects that Rivka just described at the Institute in Berlin with 5 other colleagues, Michael Gordon, Rebecca Lemov, Judy Klein, Paul Erickson, and Thomas Storm, on a book on Cold War rationality. And what interested us was the way in which the predicament of mutual assured destruction in that unforgettable acronym MAD, posed by nuclear weapons, placed a premium on transparent, rigid, symmetric rules that minimize deliberation, judgment, and personal discretion. So at least in the minds of the Pentagon intellectuals, it was of supreme importance that the Soviets realize, and realize in a way that should be as transparent as possible, that the American response to an attack would be immediate, automatic, and as inevitable as fate. This is a very special kind of rule. But because I'm only an innocent bystander in the 20th century, I just happen to have been born there, I wondered about the longer history of rules, which turned out to be quite surprising, especially if you are a historian of science who was, as I was, weaned on Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, which Evelyn mentioned this morning. Those of you who have read that book will remember that the central conundrum for Kuhn was how to make his paradigms, which were the defining characteristic of mature science, providing models for how to do science and how to judge science, how to advance science, how to reconcile those paradigms with rules, clearly expressed rules. The take-home message of my book is, at least since Greco-Roman antiquity through the Enlightenment, at least in the languages that I can read, rules and paradigms were not antonyms, they were synonyms. If, as I say, you were brought up in a post-Wittgensteinian tradition in philosophy, this is like saying A equals not A. And so the puzzle became, how did this happen? How did it come to be that the meanings of rules and paradigms, sometime after 1800, wandered so far apart from one another that they became antonyms, and Exhibit A being Kuhn's structure of scientific revolution, diametrically opposed to one another. That's the challenge of finishing this endless book. How to make it, why is it now that it's unthinkable to equate rules and paradigms, algorithms, and models? And I think the history lies in a chapter in the history of calculation, which is a strangely neglected field. If one looks at scribal traditions, that is the traditions of people like us, from ancient Mesopotamia and China to the present, there have been 3 pillars of our education: reading, writing, and arithmetic. We have superb histories of reading and writing. We have almost no history of calculation. I don't think that's an accident. At some point in the latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, calculation ceased to be an intellectual achievement. And I'm hoping that I can illuminate just how and when that happened. So let me start, if I can figure out how this works, let me start with a site of big calculation circa 1920. This is the office of the British Nautical Almanac, circa 1920, where the human computers, who in this case are all male, are calculating the ephemerides that will guide navigators throughout the British Empire. Since 1767, the Nautical Almanac, originally subsumed under the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, had been churning out tables of the position of the sun, the moon, various stars and planets, the times of nautical twilight, and other numbers that would allow mariners to determine their position at sea. Every year, millions of numbers were crunched by hand. Tens of thousands of values were looked up in tables. So you see those big books in the far corner, those are all the tables that they're constantly looking up values in. And scores of numerical tables, every printer's nightmare, were proofread until eyes cross and heads nodded. Looking at the salary records of the Nautical Almanac, you see that the people who were paid the most were the proofreaders, with good reason. So, except for the costumes and the furniture, this was a scene that could have been found almost anywhere where heavy-duty calculation was done, at least since the 17th century, and we now have reason to think even earlier in parts of Asia. First in astronomical observatories, and then in royal administrations. Later in the offices of almanacs like this one, government census bureaus, railways, and insurance companies. Already in the early 17th century, Johannes Kepler is whining at considerable length about the folio volumes that he had to fill with his own calculations of the orbit of Mars. The first royal astronomer in Great Britain, John Flamsteed, complained that the labor of reducing astronomical observations was labor harder than thrashing. From Pascal to Babbage and beyond, inventors of calculating machines promised calculators, now quoting Pascal, to relieve you of the labor that has so often fatigued your mind. But as Matthew Jones has brilliantly shown in his recent book, Reckoning with Matter, these machines rarely fulfilled the promises of their makers, who grossly underestimated the craft skill and the precision machining required to convert a drawing into a reliably functioning calculator. And the tip-off was that until really about 1850 or so, almost all of these calculating machines came with the instructions, you ought to check the results by hand, just to make sure. Far more useful for lengthy, complex calculations were the logarithms that were invented by the Scottish mathematician John Napier in 1614. We know from Kepler that he was jubilant when the first copy of Napier's logarithms reached him. It went through at least 7 editions until 1899, and it inspired the computation of many numerical tables, including by Charles Babbage. Such logarithm tables would have been in almost constant use by human computers at observatories and almanac offices throughout the 19th century. And that means that each consultation involved multiple consultations of tables, sometimes as many as 14 per calculation. It's not until the 1870s that reliable calculators like this one, the Thomas arithmometer, which is invented in the 1820s by a French businessman, not really manufactured until the 1850s and not in widespread use until the 1870s. It's not until the 1870s that such calculating machines can be depended upon. And then, I must say, perhaps not entirely, it's not until 1900 that they come into widespread use in government and business offices, although there are a whole lot of complaints about how often they broke down. There's a great photo at the London Science Museum which shows the workshop at the Prudential Insurance Company, which was a heavy-duty calculating center, that was devoted entirely to repairing Thomas arithmometers. It was kept in constant supply of broken down machines. But a comprehensive 1933 French survey of calculating machines admitted that for scientific purposes, I'm now quoting from that survey, mental calculation aided by writing and numerical tables still predominated. This is more or less exactly the moment when the British Nautical Almanac began to introduce calculating machines into its operations. The integration of human and mechanical calculators posed a triple challenge to what I'm going to call algorithmic intelligence. First, and most obviously, the machines rarely calculated the way in which humans did, and sometimes they didn't even calculate the way you might have thought calculation ought to be done in terms of mathematical theory. So I'll just give you one example. This is a Séguin, French machine, the Séguin calculating machine. And so the way in which mechanical calculators, starting with Leibniz and Pascal in the 17th century, had done multiplication was the way you and I would probably do it, which is by reiterated addition. So lots and lots of addition done lots and lots of times. No, this one, for reasons peculiar to its kind of player piano mechanism, does it by considering all the numbers to be multiplied as polynomials of the powers of 10. This is not intuitive. Okay, so that's the first problem. The computations of the algorithms are not dictated by mental arithmetic, they're dictated by the gear work of the machines themselves. The second challenge is to mesh the mental, mechanical, and manual aspects of calculation, which requires the supervisors to invent new procedural algorithms that divide a problem, like, say, calculating a lunar transit, into small, explicit steps. So this is algorithm in its broader meaning, not just the operations of arithmetic, but any well-specified procedure with a definite input and a definite output, which would embrace not only the algorithms of computer programs, but also cookbook recipes and assembling your IKEA couch. So that's the second challenge. And here's the point at which algorithmic intelligence, big calculation, meshes with the division of labor. This is not simply my fantasy. This picture, which comes from the article on the fabrication of pins in the great 18th century encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, was the inspiration both for Adam Smith's chapter on the division of labor in pin making in The Wealth of Nations, and also for one of the first great big calculation projects to use algorithmic intelligence. And third, the interactions between humans and machines demanded new efforts of Herculean attention on the part of the human operators, who, far from being liberated from the kind of tedium that Kepler and Flamsteed and many others had complained about, were mentally taxed as never before. And it's not, I think, coincidental that by the mid-20th century the personnel is no longer male but female. I'm going to focus in this talk on the first and second challenges that these calculating machines pose to algorithmic intelligence. So a lot in its early years, the Nautical Almanac was centered on the Greenwich Observatory, and this room, unfortunately no longer filled with desks and schoolboy calculators, would have been a fairly quiet place. All you would have heard was the scratching of quill pens and the ruffling of pages as schoolboy computers, many of them as young as 14 or 15, would have looked up numbers in tables and entered them into the pre-printed forms or precept supplied by the astronomer royal. The transition from this quiet existence to the deafening clatter of adding machines in a crowded office at the Naval College at Greenwich must have been jarring. In an urgent plea to the Admiralty, which was in charge of this operation, for larger quarters in 1930, Superintendent of the British Nautical Almanac, Leslie Comrie, described the scene. We have a large Burroughs adding machine, this thing, in continual use, which is so noisy that no degree of concentration is possible in the room where it is working. It is essential, for the sake of the other workers, that the machine should have a room all to itself. And why was the office so crowded? Because using the machines dictated that work that was previously sent out to so-called outside workers, these were either retired calculators or clergymen and teachers who were seeking to pad their modest incomes. So that work was now going to be taken over by inside workers who, as Comrie put it, were ordinary junior market labor with calculating machines, rather than the old-time highly paid computers who knew nothing but logarithms and who worked in their own houses. Now, such lower paid workers need closer supervision, and besides, these expensive machines can't be allowed to leave the office. And who were these cheap workers who operated the new machines under the gimlet eye of their supervisor? They're no longer schoolboys. They're half a dozen unmarried women, because the British Civil Service prohibited hiring married women, who had passed a competitive examination in English general knowledge and mathematics. So the nautical office went from looking something like this, the photo that I started with, to something like this. This, unfortunately, is not the nautical almanac, but I think it's a pretty good approximation of, by 1930, what the nautical almanac office looked like. And this is emblematic of a transition in many clerical situations in not only scientific contexts, but also industrial contexts. Paradoxically, the machines that were introduced with the intention of cutting costs, saving labor, speeding up production, and above all, alleviating mental effort, had at least the initial effect of hiring more workers, spending more money, disrupting production, and increasing mental effort, especially for the supervisors charged with reorganizing how the calculations were going to be done in order to integrate the human and mechanical calculators into a smooth, efficient, and error-free sequence. So let me just take one example. This is a Hollerith machine. So the Hollerith machines were invented in the 1880s to deal with the problems of the 1890 American census. And what it does is it uses punch cards which have a maximum of 45 columns, and it can be used to tabulate data really fast. Somebody still has to code the data, that is, somebody has to punch the cards, but it is much faster once that's been done. Here you see the Milk Marketing Board of the United Kingdom with Hollerith machines introduced by 1984. Note, once again, the personnel is entirely female. Anyhow, so Comrie, who is the gadget-obsessed superintendent of the Nautical Almanac, is trying to persuade his bosses at the Admiralty that they need to rent one of these very pricey machines. Okay, so how much is this going to cost? Okay, first there's the cost of renting the thing itself. That's £264. Then there's going to be the additional expense of £100 for 10,000 punch cards, plus the extra wages, I'm now quoting, of 4 girls for 6 months and 2 girls for an additional 6 months to punch in the numbers and operate the machine, amounting to another £234. And did I mention the extra £9 to the electricity bill? So you get a sum. It's going to cost £607 to do this with the Hollerith machine. It used to cost only £500. What you would do is that you would say to one William F. Doken, M.A. in Cambridge, compute the lunar ephemeris. And 4 or 5 months later would come up, neatly tied up with a ribbon, printer's copy of the lunar ephemeris. Now, however, you've got to have expensive new machines, new personnel, and as I say, new cards and new superintendents in order to complete this task. So whereas earlier supervisors of the nautical, the superintendents of the Nautical Almanac had complained that their administrative duties left them no time for their scientific work. And Comrie had a PhD from Cambridge. He was also certainly a scientist in his own right. When Comrie complains to his bosses at the Admiralty that he needs to be spared administrative duties, he says, it's because I need more time to supervise the workers. He said that it was going to take for certain calculations, the transfer from the old system, which was just to give it, there were two brothers in working for the Nautical Almanac, the Dawkins brothers, who I'm sure were on the autism spectrum. But they were the only ones who were trusted to proofread tables. So you had to give it from the brothers to the new labor force of young women, young unmarried women. It's going to take 3 months of private tuition between the superintendent and each of these young women in order just to begin the calculations. The superintendent must have anticipated some raised eyebrows at the penny-pinching Admiralty when he sent in these figures, for he hastened to acknowledge that a heavy initial cost would be justified by subsequent increases in speed, accuracy, and the saving of mental fatigue. Now, as I said, there has never been a calculating machine put on the market without the promise that it was going to save mental effort. The idea was not to replace human beings, it was to assuage this mental effort. What certainly happened in the short run was that it taxed mental efforts to the utmost. I'll return to the mental fatigue of the human computers themselves, but I want to underline here something which I see as a real error in earlier work that I've done on the history of calculation, which is to ignore the managerial effort of rethinking the entire process of calculation in terms of an entirely new division of labor, and one which has to take into account the differential strengths of humans and machines, all in the name of cost cutting. So if there were the pressure to trim costs was so strong in the context of the Nautical Almanac, by the way, during the first 3 years in which they introduced these machines, the Nautical Almanac was a full 12 months behind schedule. You cannot imagine how embarrassing this was for a guide which, of course, was time limited, ephemerides. It's all about time. But the pressures were even more intense in an industrial context, and here I'll just take a very quick example. This is the French railways, the Chemin de Fer de Paris-Lyon-Méditerranée, which was in the 1920s the largest of the French railway companies, and it's a pioneer in the introduction of calculating machines into its operations. In a 1929 article, Georges Boll, who is the head of accounting for this railway firm, and not incidentally a graduate of the École Polytechnique, France's elite engineering school, explained that the economic advantages of the new machines were really incalculable. I think he meant no pun by this. But only if every single detail of the workflow had been meticulously thought out in advance, from how to maximize the use of all 45 columns on those Hollerith punch cards, to devising icons for the kind of freight most often carried by the railway to speed up the coding process, so that instead of the women reading bœuf, or taureau or vache, they would see a little cow there, and it would speed up the coding. No detail of the process is too small to escape the supervisor's scrutiny, and he describes it as a very laborious mental effort, un travail cérébral très laborieux, requiring a great amount of reflection, observations, and discussions to make sure that such a project works well. Or in his lapidary motto, first organize, then mechanize. However different in their design, materials, power, and reliability, all of these calculation machines from the 17th to the mid-20th century promise to assuage human intelligence, not to replace it. The inference that was drawn from the capacity of machines to calculate was not that machines were intelligent, but rather that calculation was mechanical in the sense of being mindless. And this went for even calculations that were not done with any machines more complicated than a quill pen and paper. But it is a very peculiar sort of mindlessness. one that required the utmost efforts of attention and memory. And it had the very strange effect of bringing together two groups of people whom one otherwise would have thought as polar ends of a spectrum. At one end were virtuosi of mental arithmetic, and at the other were the operators of calculating machines. So mathematical or you might say calculational geniuses and calculational dunces. The history of 18th and early 19th century mathematics contains a considerable number of anecdotes about calculating prodigies who later became celebrated mathematicians. Among them are Carl Friedrich Gauss, Leonhard Euler, and André-Marie Ampère. Anecdotes circulated about their precocious feats of mental arithmetic as early signs of mathematical genius. What happens by the end of the 19th century is that there has been a divorce between calculating abilities and mathematical genius. Alfred Binet, who was the professor of experimental psychology at the Sorbonne in the 1890s, whose name you may associate with the Stanford Binet intelligence test, subjected two calculating prodigies who were performing in Paris, the Italian Jacques Inaudi and the Greek Pericles Diamanti, to a battery of psychological tests. This is Inaudi's promotional vaudeville poster for his feats of mental calculation. And he concludes, on the basis of these investigations, that the virtuosi of mental arithmetic do exhibit their talents at an early age, but are otherwise unremarkable, even backwards, in their intellectual development, remaining, as Binet put it, children who did not age even in adulthood. Binet concludes that what's truly prodigious about prodigies like Inaudi is their powers of memory and force of attention, at least as applied to numbers. And he stages a competition between Inaudi and the four best clerks at the department store Bon Marché, who are used to toting up numbers in their heads. And at least for small numbers, the best clerk at Bon Marché beat Inaudi. At larger numbers, Inaudi was victorious. So this is a systematic attempt to belittle the achievements of calculating virtuosi like Inaudi and Diamanti. However, it's exactly this focused attention, at once monotonous and monothematic, that the operators of calculating machines were expected to sustain for hours on end. And it's always been a bone of contention between the calculators and their bosses at astronomical observatories and in insurance companies, how long their hours should be. So even under the directorship of George Biddle-Airy, a man notorious for trying to eke out the last bit of calculating labor from his assistants, the hours were reduced from 11 to 8. And when Leslie Comrie, assumed the superintendence of the British Nautical Almanac, he was told by his predecessor, look, no one can work more than 5 hours at this. You'll be lucky if they work 4 hours at this. It may be different, Caldwell added as a postscript in his letter to Comrie, it may be different with your machines. It was indeed different with the machines, but even the efficiency-obsessed Georges Boll at the French Railways thought that the working day of 6.5 hours of punching 300 cards a day was the absolute maximum that could be expected from his human operators, and then only for 14 consecutive days a month. And you've got to remember that this is a physical task as well as a mental task. So each calculation involves 16 different steps, from putting the paper into the machine to clearing the tally before you start the next calculation. And in a series of psychological studies that were done on the operators of these machines at the French railways, you see that there are enormous variations. These are, at the top here are the 10 best human operators of these machines And the categories are memory, attention, and the ability to sustain monotony amongst them. One has to realize how important sustaining attention for tedious tasks was in the psychology of the late 19th century, both as an intellectual achievement and as a moral achievement in the psychology of Wilhelm Wundt, Theodore Ribot, and William James. Ribot says, it's really the only thing that separates civilized people from savages is their ability to concentrate on really tedious tasks. So doing mental calculations became the test through the 1930s in psychology labs all over the world to test not only powers of memory and attention, but also moral character. How long could you stand it was the nature of the test. This shift in the identity of the calculators and the material nature of the calculation also had echoes for mathematics. At one time, mathematical foundations had been, this was at least Frege's initial program, were thought to have been securable by grounding them in the algorithms of arithmetic as the most transparent part of mathematics. And there's a long history to this, from Leibniz's plan, typically brilliant, typically wacky, of a characteristica universalis, in which you translate all concepts into numbers and then calculate with them in order to pacify arguments, to Condorcet's plan for the universal education of French citizens. The curriculum of the École Centrale is supposed to be founded on arithmetic because Condorcet thinks that by having future French citizens internalize, not memorize, internalize the truths of arithmetic, they will be protected against the lies of priests and demagogues. But by the beginning decades of the 20th century, the fact that arithmetic calculations had been turned over, at least in part to machines, meant that algorithms, the algorithms of arithmetic, once considered to be the most transparent part of mathematics, had become amongst the most opaque. The impact of big calculation executed by sequences of humans and machines was to cloud over the transparency of algorithms to human intelligence. Even stranger was the change wrought by the interaction of human and mechanical calculators to the mindful direction of voluntary attention. Calculating machines, even reliable ones, did not banish mindfulness and monotonous attention from big calculation. They simply displaced these mental exertions to other tasks and other people. Yet in doing so, they created an entirely new form of human intelligence that was at once intensely mindful in the direction of attention, but also blankly mindless in the Wittgensteinian sense of being unsurveyable, unübersichtlich, to the understanding. This oxymoronic state of intense mental attention without understanding has become all too familiar to all of us who have ever tried to fill out a form online. It's the way we think now. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So we should take questions now for some time. Yes, please.
Thank you, Nathan. Yes, thank you very much. How long have you got? So I'll try to make this really brief. So In ancient languages, at least in the Mediterranean basin, the Greek word, for example, for rule is kanon, which is a loan word from the Hebrew. It's from kane, which refers to the cane plant, which grows throughout the Mediterranean and in Asia, and had been used to make rulers and straight edges of all kinds. That word is, by the Hellenistic period, considered to be synonymous with paradigma. Paradigma, in its original meaning, is a model, an architectural model. That set of associations between paradigm and rule continues throughout the medieval period and really through Kant. The last source that I could find that really was an unequivocal equation of the two is in Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, in which he talks about that the difference between talent and genius is that talent imitates the models or rules set by genius, and genius gives the rules to nature. The connection between that story, which is a story of rules which are not algorithmic in the sense of being definite, with definite input and output, requiring as little deliberation as possible, ideally being executed by machines. And my story is how a certain form of rule came to be the prototypical rule, a rule which would have been considered one meaning amongst many in the preceding millennia. So the story about big calculation is a story about how the algorithms of arithmetic became at once prototypical for all kinds of rules and also opaque to the understanding. So that, in a nutshell, that's the elevator talk version of the book.
Okay. Tal, please.
Right. So you're right to detect a resemblance. And mechanical objectivity, for those of you who don't know the term, is the idea that the best way to exclude epistemologically dangerous influences on science is to exclude subjectivity altogether by mechanizing processes. It can take many forms. It can take the form of using a statistical analysis rather than an eyeballing analysis of your data, in which case you have the problem of what to do with outliers. It can also take the form of mechanical techniques of making images, such as photography. It's very close to this form of algorithmic rationality because it is procedural, and it's rigidly procedural. That, I think, is its attraction also, frankly, to the philosophy of mathematics around the turn of the 20th century. For people like Frege, for example, which is that it allows no room for intuitions to slip in. So after Moritz Pasch publishes his devastating Foundations of Geometry, which suggests that even Euclidean geometry, which had been the model of rigor for millennia, was corrupted by illegitimate intuitions like, for example, superposition and proofs of congruence, this kind of procedural algorithmic rationality becomes the last best hope within mathematics. It doesn't last long. Within mathematics for granite foundations.
Snade?
Gosh, this feels like this is your life. So the question is whether I can relate this story to the rise of statistics and what Hacking calls a new style of reasoning, namely that of probability. it certainly is related, there's no question, to statistics. Without statistics, there'd be no numbers for these guys to crunch. As I said, the Hollerith machine is invented in order to crunch what Ian Hacking has called the avalanche of numbers produced by government censuses. And that in turn is the result of the democratic revolutions, starting with the American Revolution of 1775-76, which apportion representation on the basis of population, forcing governments, which had already been calculation heavy, to deal with enormous amounts of numbers that they never would have had to have dealt with before. So the statistical connection is clear. Without the statistics, especially when we move from the domain of astronomy, there is no big calculation. The connection to probability is more problematic, frankly, because these calculating machines force a re-examination of error. And one of the most important areas of probabilistic thinking in the late 18th and the early 19th century was a theory, a mathematical theory of error, first applied to astronomical calculations, and later generalized to a plethora of other domains. And the hope that's held out by the calculating machines is that they're going to eliminate error altogether. So the observatories had been living with error for centuries. So in the old regime, in every sense of the old regime, say in the 18th century, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, under Maskelyne, for example, would have farmed out these calculations to someone called a computer, an anti-computer, and a comparer, which was an attempt to detect and correct errors. So two people were doing the calculations, and then somebody else was comparing their results. With the calculating machines, all those safeguards at first fall away. And the longer and more complex the workflow is, the harder it is to localize where the errors might emerge. So all of the fruits of probabilistic thinking are at first lost in the 1920s and 1930s.
Yep.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. And I think that from the point of view of the internal development of mathematics, this separation that you mentioned, this view of arithmetic or calculation, something that is opaque and it's a hurdle to better understanding, comes not from debates about philosophy or anything like that, but rather from the hardcore, purest mathematical branch, which is number theory. And this has to do with the work of Dedekind and Hilbert, and later on, eventually Bourbaki, who very explicitly say that their aim, or the aim of their research in number theory, is to leave aside any possible calculation, because these calculations only bring obscurity to mathematics. We need, they say, on the footsteps of Riemann, they say, even though Riemann was not so extreme in that sense, we need to leave aside every calculation and get to everything only, this is what they say, by ideas. By ideas means not by calculation. So this is a very important trait in pure mathematics.
I agree, but Leo, I wonder whether or not, so I'm trying to think, what would Gauss say confronted with this view? Gauss, a man who loved to do calculations, when he went to a really bad faculty meeting, he covered sheets of paper with calculations, that in a sense, why, for example, would Dedekind oppose calculations to ideas? That is a thought extremely foreign to 18th century mathematicians like Euler or Condorcet, or even Laplace, who was not a great man for calculation. So it seems to me that your story and my story are parts of the same story, which is the devaluation of calculation.
Exactly. I agree completely with you. I'm just saying, Gauss is a turning point because he had both aspects. And a person like Huber went on his footsteps by calculating, and a person like Dedekind, who was kind of student of him, focused on the part of Gauss ideas that say
Mm-hmm.
I completed it. These are complementary sites.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's really all part of this. All part of the story about why no mathematician today will own up to being good at mental arithmetic.
Last two questions, Menachem, and after you.
Just following in Leo's footsteps, first of all, I think there's a mathematical context that can be pushed back about 60 years. Because, Simon Schaffer's Babbage, inspired by the automatic machine, and father of the idea of the great calculating machine, is also the first great fully fledged, totally dedicated promoter of the formalistic notion of mathematics, emptied of all his philosophy of analysis is really the first formalist approach. Now, the only person I can think of who wrote a full-fledged, book-length natural history of arithmetic is George Peacock, right?
Of the Cambridge Analytic Society.
And he's doing this in confrontation, in intense argument with Babbage, and in the end he gives in. So this happens in the late 1820s already, and your story seems to be couched in that great divide, and Peacock surrendered to
Yeah, I mean, I should turn this over to Simon at this point, who knows much more about this than I, but my sense is that Babbage is also part of the story of big calculation. So he's part, in 1819, of the British delegation to Paris to try to see whether or not they can publish the Prony logarithm tables that were calculated as a vanity project of the French Revolution to calculate logarithms in base 10. And my reading of Babbage, and I defer to those who know far more about this than I, my reading of Babbage is that he's at least as inspired by what Prony accomplished, by what Babbage believed to be his manufacturing methods in calculating those tables with exactly the kind of managerial approach that I described, as he is by the discussions of the Cambridge Analytical Society. So again, I think what's interesting is the confluence of these streams and the possibility perhaps now, inspired by your question and Leah's question, of a very different history of mathematics, which includes calculation not as the despised cast-off of a more primitive era in mathematics, but as an activity which became déclassée, which is no longer a part of number theory or of serious mathematics.
Last questions, please.
Yes.
How did commentators at the time talk about the gender shift of the workforce? What did they say about it? And second question, are there any surviving accounts by people who actually worked either the earlier male workforce or the later female workforce?
Right, yes. So the commentary is in brutally economic terms. When Comrie is justifying hiring these women, there are a lot of problems with hiring these women, by the way. Not only resistance of, the autistic Dawkins brothers, but also the fact that, how to put this delicately, the plumbing. There are no ladies' rooms, which means that these women have to troop across, I don't know how many buildings, which means they lose time in their work time. The other thing that's really annoying as far as Comrie is concerned is they get married. Worse, they get married to people in the office. And that means the moment they get married, the Admiralty, which has all the suspicions about women on ship and all of that, say, they can't work another minute. So those months and months of private tuition that went into preparing Miss Booth or Miss Stocks for her job are now down the drain. And so the only way in which you can explain the persistence of hiring these women with all of these disadvantages is that they're really cheap. And if you look at the salaries of these women, they're doing the exact same job for half the money. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture.
a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce Evelyn Fox-Keller under these circumstances. And the first thing I want to say about Evelyn as a sort of a general characterization of her and her work is that she is a very courageous person, intellectually and civilly. And this, I think, this is a most prominent feature of everything she has been doing since she started her work, both when she was studying physics and struggling with male derogatory attitude towards women in physics, which she wrote about, and then later on as a biologist, as a practicing biologist, and later on doing her work in a very special combination of history and philosophy of science, as well as her work on gender and science. And so I want to say just a very few things on these last two matters. I'll start with gender and science. I think that what is really special about Evelyn's work at the time was not only that she pointed to how conceptions of gender form and shape scientific work, but she actually offered theoretical construction of how and why this happens and how you could look upon this historically. And I think in that her work was very pioneering. And in some sense, I would say that that theory, whether you accept the psychoanalytic assumptions or you don't accept them, that theory gave a certain power to the analysis which just description of situation wouldn't have done. And therefore, it was, in that sense, subversive of the usual descriptions, both of gender gap and of how gender gap affects science. When you look upon her work in this very special combination of history and philosophy of biology, and I would start with something which is sort of a side issue, but is interesting. In '98, she and Lisa Lloyd together published a book about key terms. And though it was '98, if you open the book now and you look at it, you would still find it extremely useful. And in a field which changes so very much, like the life sciences, this is extraordinary. And I think it tells you something about the work that both of them have been doing there, which means that they have been looking not at the conventions and the positivist assumptions of practicing biologists, but at what are the presuppositions that guide the thought that then finds its expression in the actual scientific practice. And therefore, when she works on the language of science, of life sciences, whether it's genetics, whether it's embryology, whether it's the connection between genetics and cybernetics and whatever, whichever way you look at it, what you really find there is sort of decomposing or deconstructing the way scientists use the language and trying to show how those tools that they have been using are actually not only constricting and constraining, but are actually an impediment to any kind of scientific breakthrough. And I think in that sense, her work, whether it's on models and metaphors, whether it's on rhetoric, whether it's like in this very small but very powerful book on the, is there a gap between nature and nurture, the mirrors of
Space.
Sorry? Yeah, the merge of the space between nature and nurture. In all of these works, what you find is starting with historical narratives, I would say, conventional historical narratives in the life sciences, tearing them apart, showing the underlying assumptions, and trying to retell them in a way that changes them completely. And in that sense, makes history and philosophy of science a pioneering tool for science. And I think in that sense, in life sciences, I think it's much more prominent than probably in the physical sciences. I do think that work in history and philosophy of biology has affected the actual work that biologists do. And in that sense, Evelyn had a very important role to play throughout, from tearing apart the genetization program to very recent work that she's been doing on climate science, like the last book with Kitcher and so on and so forth. So I think that is what I would put as the most prominent. You can talk a lot about her erudition and her hard work and this and that and the other thing, but I think this is the most important thing, this courage and going through to the very basic assumptions and tearing them apart to tell another story. Thank you, Evelyn.
So now, where's the... It's on. Okay. Just talking to it. Okay, good. I thought of calling my talk, you didn't ask for a title, Menachem, but I thought, what is this about? And I thought of calling it the canary in the mind. That's me, the canary in the mind, for reasons that I hope will become clear as I go. Those of you who know a bit about my history might, and not unreasonably, conclude that my remarks this morning should be taken as special pleading. Okay? Okay. Maybe they are. And why not? After all, this is a pretty special occasion. If I cannot plead for my own perspective here, then where? I want, therefore, to take advantage of this opportunity and continue this morning's discussion and suggest, on the basis of my own personal experience, even more active forces at work behind the divide between history and the practice of science. So let me shift gears and go personal, telling you about my own experience in crossing this divide and focusing more on the risks of such migration than on the opportunities it presents. Like many other historians of science, I started out as a professional scientist, but unlike many of my colleagues, in making the shift to historical and philosophical concerns, I did not abandon my earlier identity. A fact clearly exposed by my automatic and surely indefensible use of the term science to refer to natural science. Yes, I was trained as a theoretical physicist, with a brief excursion into molecular biology and something of a career in mathematical biology. In other words, even as a scientist, I displayed a notable disrespect for disciplinary boundaries. But as long as I remained a practicing scientist, such disciplinary wandering seemed not to pose a problem. Difficulties arose only later, when I left mathematical biology and crossed the border, separating the natural sciences from the humanities and the social sciences. This border was unlike the disciplinary boundaries I had earlier wandered across. It was more like an iron curtain, separating east from west with armed guards. It is a story of how I came to cross this border, and also of how I sought to make that crossing while still refusing to abandon my earlier identity. The story of how I ended up here today, thanks to the Dan David Foundation, as an acknowledged historian of science who has spent a lifetime trying to straddle the border between the two. This is the story I want to talk about today. Inevitably, it is both personal and professional. A story that will surely say a lot about me, about how I came to think about issues like the place of gender and language in the natural sciences. But my hope is that it may also shed some light on the disciplinary relations, on the larger question of the disciplinary relations between the history and the practice of science. I began my migration in the early 1970s, and I should say right up front that leaving mathematical biology was not a career move, but a personal one. At the time, I had just published a series of papers with the applied mathematician Lee Siegel, shortly before his move to Israel, and many of you will know his name. And I was nearing what, in hindsight, sure looks like the pinnacle of my career as a mathematical biologist. I was also a wife and mother who had followed her husband on his sabbatical to California, staying home to take care of 2 small children. My work with Lee was just beginning to gain attention, and Lee was gallivanting around the country giving talks. Not having reliable child care, I chose not to go with him. And then a funny thing happened. As the year wore on, my work started to turn into a plate of cold rice. I simply lost interest. Moreover, I began to realize I wasn't alone in this experience. Virtually every other woman scientist mother I knew was having similar feelings. What was this about, I wondered. And like a good scholar, I went to the library to search for data about women dropping out of science. The data confirmed my suspicion. Something was definitely going on that was giving rise to a disturbingly high attrition rate among women in science. Now here's the really funny part about the story. It wasn't until years later that it occurred to me that there might possibly be a connection between my progressive loss of interest and the fact that Lee, through absolutely no fault of his own, was getting all the kudos for our work. For a while, I thought the problem might have something to do with women themselves. I even wrote to Erik Erikson to ask about his theories of inner space. Eventually, however, I came to the view that the cultural representation of science as male and of nature as female was more to the point. We lived in a time and a culture in which belief in the masculinity of science was deeply embedded and omnipresent. Small wonder that women were having a hard time making their way in the field. And so I asked, where did such a belief come from? What effects has it had historically, and what effects was it continuing to have? First, and most obviously on women, the women scientists themselves, but also, in many ways more interestingly, on the actual practices of science. I decided that answering these questions was probably more important than constructing mathematical models of biological processes. And so I embarked on a series of studies on gender and science. Back in New York City, I continued to teach, mostly mathematics courses, but my research has shifted to the other side of campus. This work began to acquire a fair amount of interest, and I was soon giving talks on my new subject, I called it Gender and Science, all around the country. One day, I was giving a talk at the University of Cincinnati, invited by Women's Studies, but as it happened, held in the physics department in an auditorium filled with physicists. At the end of my talk, the hands shot up. "You're not talking about what scientists do," they said, "only about how they talk." Surely it's what they do that matters, not how they talk. Moreover, you're talking about metaphor. What does metaphor have to do with the actual production of scientific knowledge? The question shook me. All along, I had blindly assumed the answer would be obvious, but of course it was not. Indeed, far from obvious. Then, as now, most scientists viewed language as a transparent medium, a passive mediator between science and nature. If and when metaphor was invoked, it would be as a kind of shortcut, a stopgap awaiting a more literal formulation. In any case, its presence was surely benign, since language, whether literal or metaphoric, was strictly passive. Surely it played no active role in the pursuit and acquisition of scientific knowledge. My view was different. I took it for granted that language guides our attention, shapes our perception. it forms the questions we ask, and even the answers that we find satisfying. But what seemed so obvious to me was not only not self-evident to them, it actually seemed implausible. And I realized that if I were to make my case about the role of gendered metaphors in science to scientists, I would need to provide concrete examples of just how the metaphors they employ shape their actual scientific work. I would need to ground my views about language and science in their own specific practices. And I thought, this shouldn't be too hard. After all, I was a scientist, and at least in a few subjects, well enough equipped to follow the technical details that would need to be analyzed. What I did not reckon on was the magnitude of the barrier that separated scientific from non-scientific arguments. I recognized neither the existence of such a barrier nor the need for any such disjunction. My first effort at demonstrating the kind of impact that metaphor can have on scientific thought drew on mathematical ecology and population genetics, two fields in which rigor was sought in mathematical analysis, yet at the same time in which the use of metaphor was both manifestly abundant and demonstrably consequential. My focus in ecology was on the widespread emphasis in the field, especially at that time, on competition as one of, or if not the prime motors of ecological dynamics. Indeed, the multiple meanings of the very term competition, from all-out war to simply consuming more or out-reproducing, suggested this as a promising place to start. And sure enough, it proved not very difficult to identify flaws in a number of standard arguments that stemmed from slippage between one meaning and another. My second example focused on problems of calculating birth rates that arose from treating reproduction as if it were an asexual, that is, an individual process, as in, for example, I have a son. Consider, for example, the task of calculating the birth rate of an organism of a particular genotype, a standard problem in both population genetics and ecology. Are we to understand this birth rate as the total number of offspring of an organism of that genotype, or as the total number of offspring born with the genotype in question, whatever its parentage? In fact, one interpretation is conventional in population genetics, and the other in ecology. I'm missing a line here, where reproduction is produced by organisms of all genotypes. In both communities, they are treated, the notion of reproductive rate, are treated as if they were the same. But for sexually reproducing organisms, they are not. The result is an actual contradiction, which conventionally is hidden by a fudge factor in order to allow the two communities to share results. Scientists abhor contradictions, and I naively thought I was home free. Surely, if I could demonstrate a real contradiction resulting from linguistic imprecision, working scientists would have to pay attention. So, when I was invited by former colleagues from mathematical biology to give a seminar on gender and science in their colloquium series, I happily agreed. But I suggested giving two lectures, one general and the other specific to their own work in mathematical ecology and population genetics. My plan was to focus the second talk on my efforts to demonstrate how their language might shape the technical work in which they themselves were engaged. They agreed. The general talk went just fine. They were good liberals, they were friendly, they were sympathetic. They were happy to talk about gender bias and about the obstacles facing women in science. But the second talk, in which I tried to show how the consequences of conventional gender metaphors in their own actual work, that raised immediate and intense hackles. Apparently, in straying beyond the boundaries of their field, once mine as well, I had abrogated my license to say anything at all about the technical issues that could arise. Finally, the organizer of the seminar, a very distinguished scientist and the friend and former colleague who had initially invited me, got up on the verge of apoplexy and shouted, Okay, so we leave sex out of evolution. So what? We leave out all sorts of things. We leave out freckles. Really, likening the role of sex in evolution to that of freckles is pretty funny. I don't want to give his name, but my host was, in fact, an extraordinarily accomplished and widely esteemed scientist. He was smart, sophisticated, and altogether a very nice guy. So what led him to say such an absurd thing? I was mystified. Clearly I had stepped on some very sore toes, but what exactly had been the offense? They did not challenge the logic of my reasoning, but rather seemed offended by the very fact that I was venturing to make such arguments, however good they might be. It seemed I had abrogated this right to criticize their work by straying out of the field. Probably it was my naivete that explains how stunned I was. But also I found myself with a big problem. How was I to make my case about the force of language in scientific work if my non-science readers could not follow the technical arguments, and my science readers simply rejected my analysis out of hand? Far more than a dilemma, this felt like an impasse. It certainly brought to the fore how persistently and how stubbornly that divide insinuated itself, and how naive the illusion that I could just blithely override it. It also left me not knowing quite what to do. After all, my strength was my ability to talk to both audiences and make at least enough of the science intelligible to lay audiences. And I was committed to doing so to the extent of my ability. For the next few years, I shied away from efforts to engage scientists in their own terms, and, though reluctantly, focused my work on audiences in the humanities and social sciences. But here, too, I ran into the same problem, although from the other side. I recall, for example, giving a talk in Paris some years later to a group of historians of science who, at the end of my talk, asked, "Evelyn, are you speaking as a scientist or as a historian?" My response was to refuse the question, but they would not accept a refusal. Without a single exception, they all insisted that I must choose. This, however, I simply could not, or perhaps just would not, do. In fact, their demand made no sense to me. Of course, I recognized that the division between science and non-science was deeply ensconced in the minds of most people, but I continued to believe that, in principle, it ought to be possible to override it. Indeed, I hold to that belief to this day. But I don't think that I have, at least not as yet, persuaded many of my non-scientific colleagues. Certainly this was far from the only occasion in which I heard such a demand, coming implicitly or explicitly from historians of science. Indeed, there were times when my refusal to choose seemed to disqualify me as a bona fide historian of science, but still I persisted, and again, I have to say my gratitude to the Dan David Foundation for legitimating me as finally as a historian of science. In 2000, I published a conceptual history of genetics, arguing that the very notion of the gene, although undoubtedly immensely useful over the course of the 20th century, had by now, by the dawn of the 21st century, come to outlive its usefulness. More specifically, I identified a number of properties that had tacitly, but as it turned out, mistakenly, been attributed to the units of inheritance that early geneticists had hypothesized and designated genes. I called the book The Century of the Gene, and thought, indeed, I still think, it was pretty good. I might even say it was prophetic. It appeared just after the first draft of the sequence of the human genome was announced, at a time when confidence in the power of that information to provide all the answers we sought was just beginning to decline, and when the promotion of new approaches, most notably the development of a new systems biology, was beginning to attract attention. Here was a book that I thought, finally, that scientists, geneticists in particular, would really like. It had no politics, had no feminist ranting, only straightforward scientific reasoning. But alas, it was not to be. The book got off to a promising start with advanced publicity and a wonderful article in the Sunday Guardian with a full-page photo, great photo, on the front cover entitled "Fox Among the Lab Rats." But it soon became evident that quite a few geneticists, most of them American, were not amused. In fact, they were enraged. In a review published in Nature in time to coincide with the book's release, the population geneticist Jerry Coyne accused me of waging a jihad against the gene. And to make sure to reach my non-scientific potential audience, Coyne's partner, Anne McGurran, published a look-alike review in the New York Times Book Review section under the title, "Backseat Drivers." This was a pretty extreme response, and I should tell you that there were other people who had some very nice things to say about the book. But in the heartland of genetics, the alarm had been sounded. And to this day, when I venture to speak to technical audiences, I do so with my heart in my throat. Now, why am I telling you all this? And what exactly am I complaining about? After all, I myself have had a wonderful career, far more successful than I could ever have imagined. Hey, look at this magnificent prize I've just been awarded. Yet I think that my experience suggests a problem that does indeed warrant complaint, even if not on my own behalf. As I've already indicated, I've spent virtually my entire professional life chipping away at, worrying like dogs do to bones, the boundaries that separate disciplines. You might say my specialty, my discipline as it were, has been interdisciplinarity. And I'm both saddened and puzzled by the intransigence of this particular border. Especially I am saddened and puzzled by my own failure. I have chipped and chipped, but I see no evidence of its opening or of its disarming. I submit my experience to you, my efforts to find a passage in which an open exchange of ideas with the practitioners of the disciplines I study might be possible, along with my failure in these efforts. I submit this to you as an instance of the canary in the mine phenomenon. That's the canaries, if you don't know, that miners would carry down to the tunnels with them to detect the presence of dangerous or lethal gases. Clearly, I triggered a tripwire of some sort, but how exactly? Of just what was it warning me or us, and what does it indicate? To be sure, some obstacles to communication are obvious, perhaps especially the obstacles of expertise and academic territoriality. But I think there are also others, ones that might even be of historical interest, especially at those critical moments in scientific history when a historical perspective might be most useful. At such moments, both opportunities and obstacles arise precisely because the historical analysis does bear on issues of current scientific interest. That is to say, I'm thinking of moments where dialogue between history of science and science promises at one and the same time the greatest value and the greatest threat. Moments of radical shifts that may not amount to revolutions, but that certainly signal a changing of the guard. We can call them paradigm shifts. I'm suggesting that scientists may well experience external interference, as threatening precisely to the extent that they feel their own long-standing beliefs under greatest threat from within. In other words, precisely in moments of internal challenges to their own traditional paradigms. If so, attending to the responses of the scientific community to external perspectives might provide useful signs of deep changes impending in their own disciplines. Maybe the main significance of the wire I had tripped was as an indicator of just such impending change. I also suggest that much the same can be said about the responses of historians of science to interventions seen as coming from without, in particular, interventions suspected as being too saturated by scientific culture. As we can see from my brief remarks about the history of science, this field too has its shifts in paradigm. We saw one such shift in the time of Kuhn, and maybe, just maybe, we are seeing signs of another today. Thank you. Okay.
Do you think that if the scientific audiences, especially the geneticists of whom you spoke, had not been so dependent upon public funding, that their reaction would have been as virulent? Most science in most countries these days is funded by public funds, which makes the scientists, at least at second group, very vulnerable to what they see as public exposure.
That's a very good question, Rainey, and I think the answer is yes. I mean, in fact, I think it was pretty clear in the late 90s there was quite a bit of critique of the Genome Project, and a tremendous amount, and the biotech firms responded by, and there's archival evidence for this, by urging organizing conferences that would boost the reputation of the gene. So it was quite explicit. But I don't think that's enough of an answer. I do not, to tell you, I do not really understand the defensiveness. The science wars are another indication of that defensiveness. These are people who have, it would seem that they have a great deal, it sort of goes against what my remarks at the end of my talk about being under threat. You also see this defensiveness of scientists who don't look under threat at all to me, who look like they're sitting pretty, but they really want that unconditional support.
Yes, I think it's a kind of going in the same direction. I want to say, first of all, I think that Evelyn's work on the concept of the gene and the assembly of the gene, I think that today, for example, if you're looking at philosophers of biology, for them, your work is a foundational thing, and take it for granted and go from there. So a lot of people within the community of philosophers and historians of biology, for them this is self-evident, and so it is for many of the more intellectual among the biologists, and such people exist. I want to say something about, I think that one of the things that threatens people so much, Jerry Coyne is a population geneticist. He built his whole career on modeling, on models of thinking about genes of entities made of basically DNA, and starting his whole view of biology from the foundation, from this, the unit of development, of selection, of evolution, was the gene, and it is from this that he is trying to understand patterns and adaptations in the biological world.
But that's true of the entire discipline of population genetics.
And the entire discipline of that. Now, what Evelyn is saying is you have to look differently at heredity and the gene and the gene, and this is threatening the very core for this people. And I think this was why population geneticists in particular, who are not greatly funded, have been very, very virulent. And because they feel that and they see evolution as basically described through population genetics. For them, evolution is a change in the frequency of genes and populations. That's it. So if you see it in this way, and then it is the very notion of the gene and the very notion of heredity that is threatened, I think this is it is obvious why the reactions were so antagonistic and so aggressive defensive. But I think that we're in a different place now, in a different point in time now, and I think that Evelyn has helped us get there.
But I have to say, I agree that biology is in a different place now, but the hostility has not declined. It's just astonishing. Yes, and geneticists say, well, of course they know what I'm saying, and in the same breath, but it's false.
Can I just add one tiny thing? Yeah. I think one of the threats for population geneticists and the genetization program at large is that you take agency from the genes, and where do you put that agency? That's the issue. So where you put that agency?
Well, you know where I put it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a threat. That's exactly the threat, I think. Kim.
I don't know, it seems to be a counter to the idea of gene information in all new scientific field. A very nice metaphorical, perhaps, name of gene entity. Inside of that, we find whispering of life. But there are journals and a lot of discussion, regulation, and genes. Maybe it's a comeback.
Maybe, but the interesting thing about, and I talked about this phenomenon this morning, the interesting thing about biology is how their capacity to maintain old views of the face of change. So that's why I say they often say, yes, of course, what you say is obvious, and it's not true. Yeah, and they go back. So if you, just pay attention to the discussions of genes. For example, in the sessions that many of us have been to at the David Foundation, you see that old way of talking about genes reasserting itself all the time. And you see it everywhere. So, yes, change is happening, and not so fast.
Any more questions?
Thank you. So I want to try to connect what you just said to your talk this morning, where you talked about polysemy. And it seems that if you're raising questions about genes among geneticists, they will say at this point, oh, if you're wrong or right, but it is old hat. These issues are well known, and we kind of take it for granted in our work. And then you look at the work, and they can write these papers that actually challenge basic assumptions about genes, but you look at the methodology, it assumes these genes.
Right.
And then you ask them, what about this? And they say, but we don't know how to do it differently.
Yes.
So I think we have this interesting tension that we can see, contrasting what you said this morning and what you're saying right now, in how the conceptual apparatus changes and restructures around these fault lines, and how the practices and methods sometimes lead the way, sometimes are behind, and so on. And I think this is something that, as historians, perhaps we may shed light on both for ourselves and to our scientific interlocutors.
Yeah. Well, I remember a conference I went to, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, on medical genetics, and I talked about among other things, I talked about the HapMap project and the search for disease-causing genes by identifying changes in the nucleotide sequence. And I raised my hand, I said, what proportion of these mutations are in protein-coding genes? And they said, well, very few, of course. And I said, well, why refer to them as the genes causing disease? And they went kind of wild. And they said, well, they don't, what else should we call it? Or they're near genes. And finally somebody said, we like genes. I mean, the debate really degrades very quickly.
Just going to follow up on Ruth's point, that I think it's not so difficult to explain the resistance to this idea that there are no genes.
Well, there are genes,
I
depending.
mean that there are no single genes, and you could do very people and so on. Because you basically try to replace a very clear and very attractive picture with a very messy picture.
This is very messy, yeah. No, it's certainly messy, but interesting.
Do you think, we talked about this a little bit,
Yeah.
do you think that your interdisciplinary kind of unique education has allowed you to see some things
Yeah, that and my personality. I think I kind of sniff around. Yeah, no, but certainly and I have to thank my education in theoretical physics. That's where I got my arrogance from. Biology and society are intertwined in many different ways. I mean, they're intertwined in the production of the biology, in the dissemination of the biological knowledge, in the application of biological information to technologies that shape life. So there are many levels of intertwining, and I think in order to, as part of the integration of biology and society, it's necessary to understand how the interconnections operate on the different levels. So.
I have two questions. One is for the audience.
Okay.
So I wonder how many scientists are here?
Not too many.
So, people who are practicing lab work and who, when they send the grant for their ISF or somewhere else, the category they pick is not philosophy or history. So that, okay. So, and so my second question is to you, because it took me about 3.5 hours this morning to drive and to hear you people. I read your books and your papers. It's an inspiring experience, and I was sure when I would come here, and I know how your work influenced me, and at least scientists or ecologists and evolutionary biologists that I worked with. So I was expecting a different picture here, very different picture. And my mother has a very smart remark. When there's a conflict, she asks the one who says that this guy, nothing is working with him. So she always asks him or her, so what do you gain from that conflict? How do you add to it? So my two questions for you are, first, do you think there's some gain, some benefit for historians and philosophers of science of this kind of gap that we say we want to bridge, or I don't know, after what you said, I don't know if I want to bridge, but that we want to have a different kind of dialogue with scientists. Do we gain anything from this divergence? Okay? And the second, if we are looking forward to a more interdisciplinary, a more dialogic relations or involvement between history and philosophy of science, and, or at least in my case, biology and biologists, if we want to change this picture, what should we do different? Or what would you, if you would want,
Well, I do want.
what would you would advise someone else?
Well, that's my problem. I have tried for the bulk of my career, certainly my career as a historian and philosopher of science, and I think I have failed. So I can't give you a recipe. Now, what stops people from engaging? Well, there's some obvious answers. And one is, as I say, territoriality is an obvious one. Historians of science, many historians of science don't feel the motivation to engage in such a dialogue. They don't feel the need for it or the relevance of it. Many historians, and they don't have the technical background to really engage with certainly with contemporary science. And scientists don't have the will, they don't have the interest, they don't have the time. Scientists, and we were just talking about this, and I talked this morning about how impossible it has become to read even the popular science literature. It's undergone just a total transformation, and in fact, it's hard enough for the scientists themselves. Many of them, or some of them, hire people to read the literature for them, and just to tell them what's important. So I don't know what to suggest. I was hoping you could help. Simon, you believe in that. But what can be done? I don't know.
So I just want to add something to that.
Okay.
In recent years, I co-organized 2 workshops, one with Eva Jablonka on transformations of Lamarckism, and the second one with Ehud Lam and Ayelet Shavit on landscapes of collectivity in the life sciences. And in both conferences, what we did is we made philosophers and historians of life sciences meet with practicing scientists and be together for 4 days of workshop, because there was sort of an assumption that there are issues and there are questions that are common to all 3 groups and that they could discuss fruitfully together. And it happened. It actually happened. You were one of them, you know that, in the Lamarckism one. Yeah, and so I think
There are always some, but not.
but I think the way, maybe the way, one of the ways, there isn't one way, but one of the ways to do it is to try and find common issues, common problematique that would get 3 communities together and be together and discuss what can be done on these problematique together. And this maybe will create bridges that otherwise are very, very difficult to create.
I think another thing has to do with language. And when I write as a philosopher, how much do I really care if biologists read my work? It's not just about territoriality. Having, as you said, a background in science and caring deeply about scientific questions could, I would say, could and maybe should encourage us to write and engage scientists in a way that we could not think. I could not think of myself, of my work as important enough. If I'm talking about science and no scientist, it's not relevant to anyone's work except me and my fellow student or philosophers. So I think it's up to us as philosophers, as humanists, to care about what we write as who reads it. And I'm not sure we care enough about scientists reading, and not just reading, using our work.
But if we did care, what would we do? I care.
I think, so I don't want to catch time, but
No.
so the way I see it is a lot of the arguments come when someone feels he's going into an external audience. But a lot of the agreements come when you actually do the work. So I think there's salvation in practice. When I do a survey work with an ecologist and I ask him about these core concepts, like your book about key concepts.
Keywords.
So when I talk about these core concepts of ecology while I'm doing the work with him at the field,
back to the last session of the afternoon symposium dedicated to the work of Professor Simon Schaffer. And like Evelyn, I'll be personal. So I first met Simon in 1983, when we were both still young and energetic whippersnappers at the outset of our careers. Simon was a little more advanced than me and has remained as such ever since. I was still writing up my doctorate on Whewell at Queen's. Simon had just finished his, as I recall, on the history of astronomy with Michael Hoskins, right, at Cambridge, and had recently landed a job at Imperial College London, which he described at the time as the greatest budget cut in the history of science, as he was hired as a junior lecturer to replace both Rupert and Mary Bowes Hall. And little was I aware that during that period I was writing up my Whewell, which had a fantastic print run of 500 copies before OUP scuttled it, that Simon was finishing his masterly bestseller with Steve Shapin on Leviathan and the Air Pump. We got together often during my year at Queen's, during which, having a pint or two at the Wheat Sheaf in Oxford, prompted by Simon, we fantasized about the book on William Whewell, whom we were both interested in at the time. The book on William Whewell we'd have wanted to read, but nobody had written. And on a Wheat Sheaf napkin, we jotted down the chapter headings of the book we wanted to read, and then, after a third beer, I think, we started fantasizing about the people we would have liked to write those chapters, and we jotted their names down. And with that ink-stained napkin, we approached Angela Blackburn, I think her name was, at Oxford University Press, and it was accepted. And the napkin was published. I mean, it materialized into a book. And the rest is history. Returning to Israel, I realized immediately that Yehuda Elkanah had spotted Simon, and whom he appointed Silverman professor at the, it was not yet called the Cohen Institute, at the Institute, right, in 1987 that was, and added Simon to the highly select group of HPS talent that Yehuda had sort of spotted and rounded up and caused to pay frequent visits to Tel Aviv, to be part of the absolutely true mythic history of the Cohen Institute. Now, I'm telling you all of this instead of reading out a list of Simon's writings and honors, which you can easily look up and read for yourselves, because of that wonderful experience working closely with Simon, arguing with him, tossing around ideas, writing up shared texts, and what I want to convey is that nothing short of a continuous roller coaster masterclass in the liveliest and best informed intellectual engagement was that period with Simon, who remained fast friends since. And each time we meet, although it's become slightly infrequent in recent years, it's as though we've never been away. It's an extraordinary experience working with him. And Simon Schaffer has never reserved that engagement with his close friends and colleagues. His CV of 2017, this is a year ago already, lists 45 doctorates written under his supervision with that same type of energetic engagement, and 41 radio and especially television broadcasts, which if you haven't seen, I very, very strongly recommend you do, especially one, Light Fantastic, The History of Light and Optics, a 4-part series on BBC television, which is a masterpiece of history of science. He's one of the most prolific, original, and influential historians of science alive, and it's an enormous pleasure and an honor to have him here today alongside Rainey and Evelyn. And Simon will talk about material culture and scientific enlightenments in the plural. Simon.
Thank you, boss. Can we lose the lights a bit? Can we turn the lights down so you can see the image? Which I take it you cannot see. Bravo. Cool. Better? Okay. Thank you very much, Menachem, for that actually very moving and, as I hope to show, apropos reminiscence. So, my sermon today comes from the, I think unjustly neglected, but extraordinarily influential Cold War historical epistemologist Oscar Hammerstein III. When I'm feeling sad, he wrote in 1959, I simply remember my favorite things and then I don't feel so bad, unquote. One of my happiest professional memories, Rainey has already referred to it, and rightly so, was the series of 3 meetings that she convened in Berlin at the start of this millennium between a group of art historians and historians of science, the result of which, as I hope many of you will know, We Need the Royalties, was a volume that she edited, and I should say edited brilliantly, entitled Things That Talk, 2004. Today's enormously flattering and happy occasion seems an appropriate moment, to me at least, to revisit and reflect on what was and is at stake for the history of science in that timely attention to eloquent things, things that talk. And it's doubly appropriate because, as I want to show in these reflections, I want to address a remark that Evelyn Fox-Keller makes in one of her astonishing examinations, as we've just heard, of the long disdain and eventual recognition of notions and patterns in the sciences of gender and of life, once judged entirely unthinkable. What she calls, this is the phrase I want you to remember, a rare and wonderful moment when success teaches us humility, unquote. Really beautiful phrase about scientific enlightenment. And of course, enlightenments like that have histories, and I'm going to tell you one now. I'm following here in someone who played an even more important role in the development of our discipline in the 1950s than did Oscar Hammerstein. And I'm referring, of course, to Michael Polanyi. In an extremely fascinating and under-examined passage in Polanyi's masterpiece, Personal Knowledge, he writes, quote, "While ordinary people were once and always convinced of the fall of a meteorite, academicians managed to explain the facts away to their own satisfaction. The point being that everybody except scientists believed that stones fall from the sky, even, as we'll see, in Israel." Polanyi declared, and I quote from him again, "We regard these acts of skepticism," and he means official skepticism, as unreasonable and indeed preposterous, unquote. So what I want to do with you today is to combine attention to such enlightening reversals of belief. Remember Evelyn's phrase, the rare and wonderful moment when success teaches us humility, right? So once the scientists decided, oh my goodness, the plebs are right. Did success teach them humility? We'll see what happened. Now, I want to combine attention to those scientific enlightenments, those reversals of belief, with attention to how things talk to eloquent objects. Things now are so eloquent that apparently you can tell the entire history of the world with only 100 of them. Or if you're director of the British Museum. Otherwise it's really hard. And an exhibit of a history of the world in 100 objects is now on tour. Last year it went to the Gulf and China and Japan and Australia, and this year it's going around Africa. Not all 100 objects, obviously that would be too noisy, because each of them have a story to tell. So I thought I'd start by reminding us of the array of talkative things, the ways in which cabinets of curiosity, museum collections, and so on and so forth have become so important, not just in the workings of the sciences, but perhaps at least as equally fascinatingly in the display of the sciences as forms of art. Here in Mark Dion and Robert Williams' absolutely remarkable set of displays, Theatrum Mundi, which is 16, 17 years old. And of course, the range of things that preoccupy the histories of the sciences is disorderly and chaotic and heterogeneous indeed, ranging as it does from obviously artifactual things like this collision apparatus, which I introduced because it reminded me of the Dan David logo, basically, to things like this, which, as you've already guessed, will provide the burden of most of my talk. These are some things left over from the meteorite which dropped on Normandy in 1803 and whose sole historical function was to convince Jean-Baptiste Biot that peasants are right and stones can fall from the sky, as we will see. This, however, is my favourite thing. This is the Enzyme Meteorite. This is a celebrated stone, fantastically talkative, telling here, not least because such stones have figured so much in the history of theories of things, but for many reasons to do with enlightenment. It weighs about 130 kilograms. It's preserved in Ensisheim Town Hall in Alsace in the department of the Upper Rhine. According to a notice board that once hung next to it, listing its observed empirical properties, quote, "It has neither taste nor odour." Just think about that for a moment. It is blackish, scaly, streaked with white veins, strewn with white and shining grains of a mineral nature. It is of such a hardness that in hitting it with steel, it bursts out in sparks. No solvent, not even vitriol, affects it, except that it makes it smell of a very fetid sulphurous oil. If it's completely burnt and then immediately quenched in water, it can be reduced to a powder, unquote. We now, that is to say, experts on this thing, now understand it as the oldest surviving Western European meteorite. By Western European there, I mean it dropped in Western Europe, okay? Where it comes from is not Western Europe, right? Why is that so funny? I mean, it is funny. Why is that funny? We will come to that. It's reported to have fallen In November of 1492, I mean, its timing throughout history has just been brilliant, right? November of 1492, witnessed by one boy making a hole 1 meter in diameter in a nearby wheat field. There it is, dropping. And seen from across the Rhineland and northwest Switzerland. 3 weeks later, which is why we have these images from Brandt and Schilling. This is the Sebastian Brandt who made the Narrenschiff Chronicle, who made the Ship of Fools. The same Brandt. 3 weeks later, the young Habsburg ruler Maximilian entered the town of Ensisheim, ordered the stone hung in the town church. He correctly saw its arrival as a sign of his imminent victory over the French and his accession to the imperial throne, obviously, but incorrectly, you can't get everything right, thought that the stone was also a sign of the fact that he was going to beat the Turks, which he didn't. This is a thing, then, that started in this world as an eloquent sign. The stone was celebrated by the famous humanist author Sebastian Brandt. It was described by the monastic wizard Johannes Trithemius. It was it was painted by Dürer. There. This is on the reverse side of Dürer's great painting of St. Jerome that now hangs in the National Gallery in London. If you turn it round, I mean, not that I'm allowed to do that, but if you turn it round, you see this fireball, which it's very plausibly argued is the fireball which generates the stone that is now hanging in the town hall in Ensisheim. And there's some argument, I'm a bit sceptical about this, that that fireball is that image in the top left of Melancholia 1. Do you think they're the same image? We could vote on that. I'm a bit sceptical, but it's a possible association, right? So it's a famous image. That's what I need you to get. In other words, something about this stone is its long history. We could easily multiply that history. It was described by Conrad Gesner, who worried, understandably, about how much had already been removed by souvenir hunters. The Swedish destruction of the town in the 30 Years' War nevertheless left it unscathed. In 1771, a new law graduate from nearby Strasbourg, Johann Goethe, in accord with the skepticism of that time, so Goethe recalls, ridiculed the credulity of mankind precisely because Goethe, being a good enlightened lawyer, agreed with his masters that the notion of stones fallen from heaven was simply a popular superstition, and here was an example. In the third year of the new French Republic, 1794, it was peremptorily taken from the church to Colmar Library and subjected there to stern examination by the local chemist, Charles Barthol, who analysed its composition, 20% iron oxide, 17% alumina, provided the account later printed on the placard. So he's the guy who actually ate it. Right? That's what you did if you were a Jacobin, anti-clerical chemist. You went around eating meteorites. He judged it a stone washed from the nearby hills. He explained away the local cult as an example of peasants deceived by the fact that the pyrites in the stone glittered so much. But the stone soon hit back. Between 1794 and 1802, Göttingen's scholars and London naturalists were so impressed by the similarity in composition of such stones, whatever their provenance, that they began to guess that maybe such things were not local, but cosmic. Right. Paris chemists ordered onto the job agreed eventually that this Ensisheim stone fitted the type. Back in Alsace, the local historian compiled a catalogue of Renaissance chronicles to back up the new official version and damn the Jacobin chemist Barthol as incompetent. The stone was put back in its place over the church choir. Goethe was converted to a belief in the extraterrestrial origin of the stone, and he had a bit in his cabinet in Weimar. And this is where the stone now is. These are all the bits of the stone that weigh more than 40 grams and where they are, right? So there is quite a lot in Ensisheim, and really quite a lot in the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, and then you're never very far from a bit of this stone, frankly. Especially if you're in Oxford, I have to say, or Calcutta, or Tucson. You get the point. In 1854, chunks of the stone in New York were used to calibrate samples of the first American meteorite fall, and in 1881, Ensisheim, now temporarily part of the Kaiserreich, German geologists scrubbed it with soap, surprise, surprise, and composed a long drinking song about its virtues. Quote, they scrubbed, and I can't do the accent, or the voice actually, they scrubbed him thoroughly and restored to splendor the prince of the sky. By 1891, a Yale professor had calculated its original orbit around the sun. The stone is now under the custody of these absolutely fantastic people who showed me round. Les gardiens de la météorite de Eisenheim. There they are, bless them. I mean, they're just lovely. Thank you very much to them. And they like wearing red capes and plumed hats, as you can see. And according to one story they told me, not all the stone that's in Ensisheim is in the town hall. A local farmer, according to the Gardien, is allegedly reported to be using one bit to weight down his barrels of sauerkraut. Okay, that's my story, really. I could stop now, but I won't. Now, no doubt this stone, entirely alien, I mean, it comes presumably from the asteroid belt, almost certainly, and has been around with us for well over 500 years, entirely domesticated, belongs to the long catalogue of what I propose we think of as fetishes that preoccupy devotees of the history of things. Under the regimes of iconoclasm and demystification, fetishes are those things that exert powers that others who claim superior knowledge deny such things can possess. And there's a specific cartography and geography of such things and regimes. This is partly because of the received distinction between objects and things, a distinction I take from actor network theory. It's as though objects become things when they object. I don't know if that works in any other language except English and maybe French. So things become objects when they protest, when they resist, when they deny the label that we might unwontedly try to put on them. We need precisely a specification of those places where objects can be deliberately made to stop working for us and misbehave so much that they then become things that we can confront and understand. They acquire a voice and an autonomy and an independence. And that principle is what has nourished the philosophical position of metaphysical realism for the last 2,000 years, I think. In the life of things like our stone, these special places include the field site, the statistical office, the church, the chemistry laboratory, and so on. Especially, I think, the cabinet and the museum, where objects' recalcitrance is somehow ingeniously mobilized in order to turn it into a pathway to understanding. And once that understanding is achieved, and here's the nub of what I want to try and communicate, once that understanding is achieved, all agency is then attributed to the thing, and nothing remains of the story I've just told. Now, there's a very long tradition of course, which I've been trying to make sense of over the past few years, and which Shaul, for one, has already heard me wax lyrical about in Bielefeld. So he's being terribly tolerant by even being here, frankly. Which is to do with the autarky and autonomy attributed to things. And I trace it provisionally back to this passage from Herodotus' Histories, from the 4th book of the Histories. Because here is a location where things started to talk for themselves. And they did so in very, very interesting circumstances. So here Herodotus is speaking of a land beyond the Pillars of Hercules. I'm assuming you can't quite all read the quote, so I should probably read out a bit of it. He tells of a land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where Carthaginian merchants engaged in a strange and strangely reassuring trade in gold. These travelling merchants, and I'm quoting from the father of lies here, no sooner arrive, but forthwith they unload their wares, and having disposed them after an orderly fashion along the beach, and returning aboard their ships, they raise a great smoke, and when they see the smoke, the natives come to the shore, and laying out to view as much gold as they think the wares are worth, they withdraw to a distance. Upon this, the Carthaginians come ashore, and if they think the gold enough, they take it and leave. If it does not seem sufficient, they go aboard the ship once more and wait, and then the others approach and add to their gold until the Carthaginians are content. Neither party deals unfairly with the other, for they never touch the gold until it matches the worth of their goods, nor do the natives ever carry off the goods till the gold is taken away. This is the silent trade. In other words, a myth about the origin of our disposition to truck, barter, and exchange, in which things are so eloquent that commercial relations can take place without speech, without any encounter other than via the commodity form. And it's precisely because of that this form of barter, unlike any other with which the readers of the histories would have been familiar, is supernaturally honest. It is precisely because there is no chat, there is no negotiation, there is no social relationship around exchange. It's entirely embodied in the thing itself that the exchange is honest and trustworthy. Were there any negotiation, the activity of barter would be warped into much more familiar economic relationships. So the eloquence of things here goes with the silencing of all social agents. And it seems to me that that notion that if humans speak, something bad is happening about their understanding of things is a really important piece of the mythopoeia of the sciences. I mean, this is not the place to go into this, but this is what Evelyn was experiencing. This is the deep principle, it seems to me, behind Evelyn's experience when she said, how you talk affects the things you know. Here is a story in which if you talk at all, if you pay any attention whatsoever to what you say, then the value of things will be distorted and subverted. It is precisely because only the things, they could be genes, in this case gold, only the things speak. And that's then related, I'm suggesting, to the long and complicated history of things domestication, which we saw in the case of the Ensisheim stone. Now, it would not have escaped you, and I've done a certain amount of work on this in a previous incarnation, that the site of the silent trade is the site of the gold trade, which completely dominated dominated early modern European extraction of value from West Africa before the extremely rapid rise in the extraction of slaves from Guinea and the Slave Coast. And indeed, there's a very long literary tradition from the early Middle Ages through the 15th century of the Common Era into the 16th and 17th century of the Common Era, which evokes the silent trade around Asante and Akan extraction of gold. This is a text from one of the very first English descriptions of the Gold Coast. They take it away and leave as much gold. They are the truest dealing men in the world. I have not found so much faith. This is a quote from the Christian Gospels, of course. I have not found so much faith nor faithfulness, no, not in Israel. So the world of the gold trade really and truly did generate this mythopoeia. It kept that story of the silent trade going well into the early modern period. Don't misunderstand me. The silent trade never happened. It's a myth. There's no evidence, archaeological or philological, of its existence. But nevertheless, and perhaps therefore, the silent trade stays as a trope right through into early modernity. And for those of you who, after a very long and very intense day, are still awake and still paying attention, you will not be surprised about where I'm going to go with this. Where I'm going to go with this is the Flying Academy of Lagado. And why is that? That's because in Gulliver's Travels, things really talk. Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, read the texts I've just quoted, notably the Golden Coast, and copied them almost line by line into sections of Gulliver's Travels. He knew the story of the silent trade. He knew the history and political economy of the Guinea trade. He began his own pamphleteering and political career by campaigning against Isaac Newton's attempt to impose corrupt coinage on the Kingdom of Ireland. He was absolutely au fait with the whole story that I've just told you. And in Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels, as you will know, Gulliver encounters the custom of sages in the great Academy of Lagado, in other words, the Royal Society, who, because they've read John Locke, know that words signify because they refer to things. And they know that talk damages your lungs. So they know two things, one from Robert Boyle, talk damages your lungs, and one from John Locke, words refer to things. The solution is obvious. Instead of speech, carry things. And show things to each other if you want to have a chat. And your wisdom, your vocabulary, will then be proportional to the cube of the number of things your servant is capable of carrying around with you when you're at the academy. It is plain, Gulliver reports, that every word we speak is in some degree a diminution of our lungs by corrosion, and consequently contributes to the shortening of our lives. Since words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men, sick, to carry about them such things as were necessary to express a particular business they are to discourse on. I have often beheld two sages almost sinking under the weight of their packs, who would lay down their loads, open their sacks, and hold conversation for an hour together. And what conversation in this fantasy academy is showing things to each other. The sages are silent. The things do the talking. Now, no doubt, the utopia Swift satirizes here is that of a world in which meanings and values travel without mediation. That's what's at stake in the Swiftian satire. The myth of the silent trade especially stressed that such commerce, as I've indicated, was preternaturally honest and never needed local agents. Normally, the Legato way with things has been associated with Swift's attack on the plain style and nominalist philosophy of the early Royal Society, its dreams of universal languages. But it seems to me that attention to the Guinea location of the silent trades brings out an important aspect of what was at stake here. In Legato, the professors assign too much and the wrong kind of agency to things. They wrongly imagine that things can communicate without mediation and that things have embedded within them innate powers to guarantee good order and true meaning. And that is fetishism. The word fetishism, as William Peets pointed out in a pair of absolutely remarkable ethno-historical essays, comes from Guinea. It comes from Portuguese and Dutch and then English and French encounter with the gold trade. So it's not anachronistic at all to apply the word fetish to the image that you're seeing here, an image which of course generated what is now called thing literature or it literature written during the Enlightenment, notably the text on the left, Charles Gilden's The Golden Spy, or a political journal of the British Knights' entertainment of war and peace and love and politics, wherein are laid open the secret miraculous power and progress of gold in the courts of Europe, which is an autobiography of a gold coin as it circulates around European society, destroying social relations, but having really quite a good time. Now, where this extraordinary relationship between eloquent things and the silent trade takes us, and here my story joins that of Rainey in a very obvious way, is in the notion of enlightenment itself. As we've seen in the case of Goethe's encounter with the Ensisheim stone, the enlightened rationally rejected the idea of eloquent stones. They assumed that every stone advertised as fallen from heaven was a fetish, that it had powers such objects cannot legitimately have. They assumed that the attribution of such powers to such eloquent things was a sign of primitive superstition in West Africa in the case of fetish gods, and in Europe in the case of thunderstones. In other words, what we would now call meteorites. This is what Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie says. Thunderstones. Their existence is very doubtful. What have been taken for thunderstones are mineral materials, perhaps some substance such as those of which the earth contains a lot in the places where it's been dug up by volcanoes which have become extinct. Thunder having struck those places, and the people having then found those substances which outwardly carry the evident marks of fire, they've taken them for what they call thunderstones. And obviously it was a smoking gun as far as the authors of the Encyclopédie were concerned, that meteorites tended to turn up in places like the Vatican. And you see the Vatican example, bottom right. Now, what changes? What is it that produces, as it were, enlightenment about meteorites? It's very striking, as you see in this graph made by the great historian of meteorites in history, John Burke, that the number of reports of meteors, fireballs, which is the bottom graph, in other words, lights in the sky, and the number of falls, in other words, meteorite stones themselves, goes up absolutely dramatically in the 15 years after the French Revolution. Right? So in both cases, you can probably just see this. You've got numbers like 3, 5, 6, 4 for the decades of the 18th century, and then 19 or 20 for decade 1800 to 1809. That's the number of meteorite falls, and similarly for the number of fireballs in the sky, which varies between about 10 and 30, and then goes up to 65 in the decade after the French Revolution. Why? Well, according to most scholars, this is why, in the decades, the 2 decades around 1800, the view that the enlightened academicians have of the reality of stones falling from heaven changes. My heretical view is that exactly the opposite is the case. In other words, it is because between 1795 and 1805, academicians changed their minds collectively and singly about the reality of stones falling from heaven. In other words, fireballs are meteorites, that the numbers reported and recorded in the museums and the archives of enlightened and revolutionary Europe suddenly shoot up. That seems to me to be a much more plausible explanation than a kind of sudden providential increase or weird change in the eyesight of post-revolutionary Europeans or something like that. So it's the change in official knowledge that changes the data here. Now, how did that happen? In my view, it happened because of a reorganization of categories of superstition and of prejudice, precisely the words that are used not only in Europe, but also in its colonies, as here in 1802, when the British medic for the East India Company in Varanasi, in Benares, sends to the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society a report of a circumstance of so extraordinary a nature as the fall of stones from heaven, which could not fail to excite the wonder and attract the attention of every inquisitive mind, and he then dismisses every indigenous witness completely out of account, because among a superstitious people, we are naturally led to suspect the influence of prejudice and superstition. My inquiries were therefore chiefly directed to the Europeans, who were but thinly dispersed about that part of the country. In other words, enlightenment about falling stones follows the contour of the social hierarchy of trust in a very precise way. Residents in Varanasi, when they see a stone falling from heaven, are being superstitious. When Europeans see a stone falling from heaven, they are being enlightened. Similarly with the museum collections, this is an absolutely beautiful image of Emperor Francis I of Austria, Francis Habsburg, and the directors of his mineral collection. Most of the stones on that table are what are now thought of as meteorites, but the director of the cabinet, the Jesuit-trained Andreas Xavier Stutz, writing in 1790, says about a particular iron meteor that the emperor was particularly proud of, look, it may have been possible for even the most enlightened minds in Germany to have believed such things back in 1751, due to the terrible ignorance then prevailing of natural history and practical physics, but in our time it would be unpardonable to regard such fairy tales as likely. So what Stutz is saying in 1790 is, it's only the ancients who believe that stones can fall from heaven, and there were even idiots as recently as 1751 who thought that, because we're now enlightened and we don't believe that stones can fall from heaven. The iconography of meteors clearly plays a role. These quite remarkable pictures of the great meteors of 64 and 83 play an important role in beginning to change the view about their possibility. But it's objects like this that really shift belief. This is a stone that fell on Yorkshire not the whole of Yorkshire, it's not a very big stone, right, in 1796, and was then brought in bits to London, where you could pay really quite a lot to see the stone and read the testimonials signed by such people as the local naval officer, Captain Topham, and the local priest, Reverend Preston, and so on. NB, the neighbourhood of that part of Yorkshire where the stone fell, in the neighbourhood of that part of Yorkshire where the stone fell all agree as to the phenomenon in the atmosphere which attended this remarkable event. When Joseph Banks, the then president of the Royal Society, saw this display, he was exceptionally sceptical of it. Why was that, Joseph? Because the stone that was put on show in London strangely resembled the stone that Williams had described falling on Benares. Banks's view as late as 96 was that since these two stones, one in England, one in India, were so similar, this must be a con trick designed to, as it were, take the piss, satirize the claims of naturalists who believed that stones could fall from the sky. In other words, precisely the evidence that 5 or 6 years later is going to be evidence in favour of stones falling from the sky, at this point is taken to be evidence against it. So even that evidence turns out not to be decisive. It's, sorry, gone too fast. It was this event, as the best recent scholarship by Mathieu Gounel at the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle has shown, it was this event that really shifted enlightened belief. The fall of the Leaureates meteorite, the meteor of the 6th of Floréal, year 11, or late 1803 in Normandy, which prompted the young Jean-Baptiste Biot and his allies to launch what has to be thought of as a Laplacian survey of a part of French territory. What really mattered here was not the collection of the pieces of the meteorite. What really mattered was the intensity with which the Napoleonic regime was linking together the bits of the stone and the behaviour of the local populace. It was their capacity to calibrate each citizen of the empire against the quality of the report that those citizens were and subjects were producing that made, in the end, the difference. What Biot did in a series of absolutely extraordinary proto-social scientific surveys, kind of scientific ethnography almost, of the relationship between the social standing of each witness and what they said they saw, the decomposition of all of this. What that did was finally to shift the views, the official views, of the Laplacian Institute of France, and therefore the Royal Society of London, and therefore the rest of enlightened Europe. So it wasn't, in the end, the similitude of chemical composition worldwide. And it certainly wasn't an increase in the number of sightings. Those I take to be consequences rather than causes. What really changed was the relationship between the eloquence of the things involved in this episode and the forced eloquence of the people involved in saying so. And in the Biot report, it's the eloquent samples that he brings back to Paris and the eloquent subjects of Napoleon the Great. Coda. This is ALH 84001. This is the most importantly eloquent meteorite of the late 20th century because for a period of about 15 to 18 years, this meteorite was believed to have carried signs of life on Mars. It was gathered in the Allen Hills in Antarctica and brought to the Johnson Space Center in Houston and then presented at a remarkable press conference on the 7th of August 1996. This is a very eloquent thing indeed. After 4 billion years underneath the surface of Mars and 16 million years in interplanetary space and 13,000 years in the Antarctic and 8 years of misclassified storage archives matter, folks. 8 years of being in the wrong place in Houston. I mean, I'd kill myself if I was in the wrong place in a fridge in Houston. But this stone kept speaking. Okay. and then 2 years hard collaborative work by geologists and chemists and spectroscopists and exobiologists. As I say, this rock appeared at this press conference. This is a press conference picture in August of 1996. Those who spoke on the rock's behalf pointed out the carbonate rosettes surrounded with polycyclic hydrocarbons, and where the carbonates had dissolved magnetic crystals of characteristic shape. They added that there was electron microscopic evidence of nanofossils. All 4 elements of that story, each combined, each separately defeasible, but in combination suggesting a tale of early Martian life. Simple journalistic enthusiasm about the possibility of life on Mars through a peculiarly eloquent rock was to be expected, but it wasn't limited to journalists. Presidential candidate Bill Clinton spoke as follows through the office of the press secretary. Today, and here I'm really not going to do the accent, right? Rock 84001 speaks to us across all those billions of years and millions of miles. It speaks of the possibility of life. If this discovery is confirmed, it will be one of the most stunning insights into our universe science has ever uncovered. Its implications are as far-reaching and awe-inspiring as can be imagined. Even as it promises answers to some of our oldest questions, it poses still others even more fundamental. We will continue to listen closely to what it has to say as we continue the search for answers and for knowledge that is as old as humanity itself, but essential to our people's future. Things talk. In the case of Clinton's press statement, they talk extremely eloquently. As many of you will know, unfortunately, ALH 84001 has turned out to be a pretty unreliable spokesrock, and there's now rather little agreement that any of the 4 variables, notably the nanofossils, are indeed signs of life, and rather what they speak of is the process which the rock experienced when it entered the Earth's atmosphere, rather than what had happened on Mars. But the point of my long excursus around eloquent rocks and the silent trade has been to remind us of how common that idiom is, and to think what that idiom means in politics, in science, and in our culture. That old faith that things are only understood and only help understanding when they speak with one voice and with no ambiguity and no mediators, when they can be entirely trusted. I have not found so much faith nor faithfulness, no, not even in Israel. That faith needs to be called into question. Shifting and shifty things do in fact, I submit, help define the standing of all the different agents who have a stake in their understanding. And those differences play decisive roles in what that understanding is. These rocks, including ALH 84001, are a few of my favorite things, not because I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling extremely happy today, but because properly located, it seems to me, they help us better understand the plurality of worlds, natural and social. Thank you. Should I leave him up? Or her?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon. The floor is open. Ori, please.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was precisely my idea when I started doing this work, and it turns out, tragically, not to work quite as simply as that. The great apostle of commentary returns in late 18th century France is Jérôme Lalande, the great publicizer of commentary returns, Halley's interpreter, the author of by far the most important popular work on popular astronomy, and who in 1775 in fact writes a famous pamphlet, a notorious one, called On the Chances That Comets Can Crash Into the Earth, which are non-zero, right? And this causes a riot in Paris. He is arrested by the prefect of police. People flee Paris because they wrongly believe that what he's done is to predict that a comet will crash into the Earth. And in Rainey's work on probability and Eric Briand's work on calculation in this period, this whole scare about comets literally falling to Earth is strongly shown to be associated with the rise of philosophical probability and the Condorcet and Laplace enterprise. However, all of those writers are ferociously hostile to the superstition that what we see hanging in Enzyme is a stone that fell to Earth. There is a massive dissociation right through till 1800, 1802, 1806 between cometary collision and meteoritic fall. It's exactly the association which seems kind of, exactly as you say, completely obvious to us. I mean, surely if you believe no longer in a version of natural theology that would preserve this planet from comets, you must see that it suddenly becomes plausible that aeroliths and thunderstones are the same thing, but they hold them apart. They completely hold them separate, right? And it's precisely the writers in the Encyclopédie who make the most of Halley and Clairaut's successful prediction of cometary return, who, as we saw, are most hostile to the superstition of thunderstones, right? You know, they are thunderstones. They are not aeroliths that fall to the ground. So what's to be explained here is how the association, which absolutely, as you say, I couldn't agree more, is a massive increase in theoretical understanding, is made, right? And it's not made in 1759. It's made in 1809, right? It's exactly that half century that fascinates me and other much more expert scholars, Ron Westrom, Eric Briand, and others, John Burke, who've worked on this, right? So I couldn't agree more. Subspecie Eternitatis, you're right. But the micro-history of what actually happened points in another direction, right? And that's what intrigues me so much. I hope that's the way of getting it right.
Maya.
So thank you. I thought it was amazing. And I want to be a bit greedy because I have two questions, but I'll try to keep them short. First, I was wondering how you look at this idiom and if it was present at the actual age of enlightenment, not if we're talking about it now, things talking, as opposed to the inanimate picture of nature that kind of grows through the scientific revolution. So I kind of see those things as contradicting, and I was wondering how you place them one against the other. And the second thing is the way you discuss the things talking and people talking through the things, kind of, and they couldn't place who was talking, the object or the subject, reminds me of Donna Holloway and the material semiotics agent, and so I was kind of hoping to get your thoughts on that a bit.
Right, okay. To the first point, yes. I'll try not to be as long-winded as I was in the actual presentation. So there's a great deal of prose, particularly in German, around a figure whom I haven't even mentioned, Chladni, which is scandalous, who is really the first writer in the 1790s firmly to make the association that seems obvious to us. So Chladni is a really, really interesting case of someone who makes things talk, because what he does is to study, as far as he can, all the North German thunderstone collections, and then link that with what Olbers and others are saying about comets, and say, look, it's now very plausible that there can be cometary collisions, and we see in our cabinets stones which seem to have the same composition, and then he literally in the pamphlet makes them talk. He says, it isn't I who say this, it is the stones that speak. I mean, that is the phrase, right? It is the stones that speak. And that was more or less how I started this little essay, right? When I find Chladni in the 90s saying, it's not me, it's the stones, right? Don't look at me, look at them. That gesture is the one that interests me. So yes is the answer. That was a very particular answer. The attribution of agency and Donna Haraway's work seems to me to be indispensable here, right? So in a completely different version of this work, what one ought to try to do, it seems to me, is to link this with the various forms of attribution of agency which science studies has experimented with over the last two generations, I mean roughly since the late 70s, early 80s, right? Because on the one hand, as I've indicated, the particular idiom, it is not me, it is it, that is talking, is the characteristic fetishistic gesture, right? Don't look at me, look at that. I mean, that's the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Right? It isn't me, it's it, okay? And that's a gesture of fetishism. All the power resides in the thing in itself, and no power, apparently, in those who are deliberately manipulating it for their own purposes. And that's what nourished, and I think still nourishes, a great deal of discourse on popular ignorance, popular superstition, elite over-imagination, and so on. I could say a great deal about that. Right? On the other hand, it's been a very radical, progressive, and it seems to me liberatory move within a lot of science studies to recognize the kind of activation that is in play in some of these stories, precisely because it seems to me to be worth going back to what Polanyi is talking about there. What is he saying, right? Why, in the middle of this extraordinary Cold War piece of far-right philosophy, which is nevertheless the founding text, or one of them, of the social studies of science, does Polanyi decide to talk about this reversal of Enlightenment faith? He does so for a reason that is very strongly linked to what Rainey was evoking for us so well at the start of the show. His argument, and you'll see this resonates with Donna's work really, really closely, right? His argument is, remember, folk cannot spell out what they have really experienced. Remember that the demand to be transparent and explicit is a demand too far, because scientific knowledge and understanding is embodied. It is personal. It cannot be unfolded. We are not citizens of the naked lunch. Do not expect, do not attempt to demand universal transparency or audit or accountability. Minister of Education, are you listening? This was a very important criticism of the regime of audit, right? And it was, in a certain sense, for us, a very progressive one, right? Because it was a defense of the artisanal and of the embodied, precisely. These examples where, to put it crudely, too crudely, the peasants were right and the scientists were wrong, were used by Polanyi as an example to justify his claim that if you disbelieve someone because they cannot spell out what or why they believe, then you risk repeating the great error that the Enlightenment committed, which was to deny something we now know is true. Right? And that seems to me to be completely tangled up with already what's in the final 2 chapters of Primate Visions, and then is developed a little more in the Cyborg Manifesto. Right? Don't demand transparency, because it's on the side of the enemy. That is a view kind of which half of me adores and the other half is going, not so sure. Still, we can talk about that afterwards.
I have Rainey and Tal down, but I want to jump in with one sentence.
Okay.
And that is that while you were talking, it occurred to me that Swift's critique of the Royal Society is not merely a critique of the Baconian myth of a reformed language. It's a critique of the Lutheran Protestant view of experimental science and the myth of literalism, in the sense of being able to read out that stones speak in that sense of the term. And then Polanyi's is a sort of Catholic reaction to that, which gives this whole thing a sort of very, very interesting religious setting. Yeah, Rainey.
My comment was hard on the heels of yours, which is getting from Laureates to Jonathan Swift. Laureates is not suspicious of interpretation. Both the Carthaginians and the natives of the Gold Coast are indeed compelled to judge whether or not the wares and the gold balance one another. Jonathan Swift is an enemy of interpretation, and I agree with Menachem. The path to raise ipse loquitur is so scriptural.
Yeah.
That it is
Exactly.
foremost the idea that texts speak without interpretation.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes the suspicion of interpretation.
Yeah.
When that becomes a word which clearly was not for Herodotus.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. If there was a Herodotus, right? And no, I mean the original formulation of the story in the histories is, on the contrary, a celebration of the capacity of hermeneutic work to make everything honest, profitable, viable, and so on. What's interesting is the fortuna of that story, right? That it survives right through medieval encounters on the western coast of Africa. It becomes very widespread as a story in the early modern period, and it's routinely resuscitated, normally in early ethnographic accounts of, let's say, for example, Seligman's account of the Vedas in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, in the early 20th century, who, he says, have stories about the silent trade. He's never seen it, right? But he says they say that's how they trade, right? And that's normally how it works. So, yes, one can't get from Herodotus, that text, to Swift immediately. One must go through, it seems to me, the confessional and the highly politicized, to put it mildly, confessional milieu in which Gulliver is being written. Right? However, it's the longue durée of this story that seems to me to be so fascinating, that against all experience, one is constantly told that one has encountered, that the person who's telling you this story has encountered this episode, has encountered this practice, right? And this ranges across Venetians, reports of Prester John, Mongol traders in Persia, South India, as I've said, Southeast Asia, in Newfoundland, and so on. So there isn't a quick shift against interpretation. By the time we get to the Academy of Lagardo, it's obvious what the problem is, right? And it must have happened at the period that both you and Menachem have pointed to. There's a sort of particular biographical detail there, which is the relation between what Swift is urging in Book 3 of Gulliver and the particular politico-theological problems that book is about, is very strong evidence indeed that it's about reading Scripture, right? Because this is the same academy academy that generates texts by machines, after all, right? And this is the next thing that Gulliver sees, right? So
and meaning by accident.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So, you know, monkeys and typewriters and Shakespeare. This is exactly the next thing, right? So the relation specifically in that text between textual interpretation and the eloquence of things is very, very clear. And the politics of that, I think, is very clear too. I mean, it's essentially an argument against evangelical Protestants, who are his enemies, like you.
Last question of the day, Tal.
No pressure.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'd like to go back to the point of turning point in your talk, when sort of there was a shift.
Right.
And sort of peasant testimony sort of started to count.
Yeah.
It seems that the peasant in that narrative is a prerequisite for things to talk. And I'd like to hear a bit more about the survey as a technique, because it seems to me to make an interesting claim, right, that suggests that we have a moment here of democratization of epistemology, or equalization of testimony. Put together all these people and all these stones. There's something that takes away agency from them and gives it to the stones. And sort of the technique becomes the main thing. So if you could comment about the role of survey in that story.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to say about that. Let me refer you in particular to the work of Ron Westrum, who many years ago wrote a marvelous piece in Social Studies of Science on on knowledge of anomalies in the case of meteorites, and more recent work by Mathieu Gounelle, Gounelle, who's curator, I mean, I'm killed for his job, right? Who's curator of meteorites at the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, which is like a perfect job. Anyway, because they stop moving once they enter the museum, so you're really safe. So what one learns from those two studies, and then reading the reports from Biot and others at the time, is that, and I'll just read out what I've written here, Biot distinguishes between an extraordinary fact reported by trustworthy people, unquote, and what he calls a supernatural fact, fait supernaturel, which must be rejected. Quote, people's agreement does not give any weight to this because the people are disposed to believe everything. Right? So what's going on is that Biot becomes a stand-in for the reliable, enlightened citizens. Right? That's what the survey involves. He spends several days in southern Normandy doing triage, teasing out the people who are to be trusted on extrinsic grounds, what he calls the enlightened workman, right? And those who are not to be trusted. And he shows that there's a correlation between the degree to which the report is, as he says, supernatural, and the degree to which they're unenlightened. And so what he's done is to forge the relationship éclairé, fiable. And it's exactly what the survey does, right? So there's this kind of ethnographic decomposition of the local population, and then it's recomposition so that essentially he's bootstrapped the fact into existence, right? And then he becomes the voice of all the samples, all the bits of stone, and all the citizens, including the ones that he's rejected. And what's very important, and here I would refer to, above all, Marie-Noël Bourguet's work, Déchiffrer la France, which is this masterpiece on statistical surveys under Napoleon of provinces like Normandy. If you look very carefully, this is an area of Normandy that has just been subject very intense Bonapartist surveys. And then another surveyor arrives, only he's from the Institute. And he has to report to the Ministère de l'Intérieur, who is the Laplacian. And that relationship, as Gounel and others have shown, is kind of simultaneously political, linguistic, it's about mediation. Do not understand this as an opening up of an egalitarian principle to peasant voices. That is not what is going on. I wouldn't go so far as to say exactly the reverse is going on. It isn't that everything is closed down and from now on only the voice of the academicians will count. From now on what will count is the integrity of the demonstrable linkages between the ultimate informants whom one never meets and Biot and their successors. Right? That seems to me to be critical for the future genealogy of the bilan of the survey, especially under regimes like that. I mean, it would be extremely bizarre, frankly, to read what's going on in 1803 in France as a kind of opening up to n'importe qui. That's not what's happening. It's a much more ingenious and exquisite reorganization of voice. And the reason, finally, that I've emphasized voice here is because of the idea of the porte-parole, of the idea of the spokesperson, and the way in which things and humans exchange their properties in that very interesting way at that decisive moment. Right? It's a shame the stone didn't fall on Burgundy, but it had to fall on Normandy. Right? If it had fallen on Burgundy, then my story would be told.
So this brings a splendid day to its end. Thanks to you being awarded this prize. Thanks for coming here. Thanks for being here. And thanks for making this day what it has been. A really, really special occasion. Thank you so much, Rainey, Evelyn, and Simon.
Can I just say, it's probably supererogatory, but I'll say it anyway, on behalf of Rainey and Evelyn, I again would like to thank the Dan David Foundation for their extraordinary hospitality and generosity, and I would like to thank our colleagues and comrades here in Israel at Tel Aviv University and elsewhere for your courage and bravery and hospitality and the warmth of your welcome and the fact that you're still in this room, which for me is like an amazingly flattering thing. So, and I above all like to thank Menachem